In this video, we'll be breaking down 2 hours of evil Morty lore to fall asleep to. Let's get started. Eye Patch Morty and the fake evil Rick. Evil Morty makes his first appearance in the Rick and Morty universe during a crisis that shakes the entire Council of Ricks. A mysterious killer is hunting down Ricks across multiple dimensions, and Rick C-137 becomes the prime suspect in a murder spree that claims 27 victims. The investigation pulls Rick and Morty into the Citadel of Ricks, where they discover a conspiracy far more twisted than anyone expected. The episode opens in a dimension that looks exactly like Rick C-137's home. The Smith family sits around the breakfast table eating together. Beth mentions that tomorrow marks the 1-year anniversary of Rick being back in their lives. She plans to make flying saucer-shaped pancakes for the occasion. Rick tells her regular pancakes are fine. The conversation seems normal until a portal suddenly tears open on their wall. 2 figures step through carrying weapons. One is a Rick holding a gun. The other is a Morty carrying a tranquilizer. The Rick shoots the family's Rick in the head, killing him instantly. The Morty shoots their Morty with the tranquilizer and he passes out. Both attackers drag the unconscious Morty across the breakfast table and pull him through the portal before it closes. The entire family screams in horror but cannot stop what happens. This opening scene establishes that something terrible is happening across multiple dimensions. Ricks are being murdered and Mortys are being kidnapped. The attackers work efficiently and without hesitation. They know exactly what they want and execute their plan quickly. The scene then shifts to Dimension C-137, where Beth celebrates the anniversary with her father. Rick thanks her and says he should be making them breakfast for putting up with him. Jerry makes a sarcastic comment about Rick owing them an entire restaurant. The mood is light until 3 armed Ricks burst through a portal into the dining room. The lead Rick announces that Rick Sanchez of Earth Dimension C-137 is under arrest for crimes against alternate Ricks by the authority of the Transdimensional Council of Ricks. Jerry tries to protest, but one of the Ricks shoots him with a freeze ray that immobilizes him completely. Rick C-137 tells everyone to relax. He knows these versions of himself just want to haul him to their clubhouse and waste his time with questions. The lead Rick orders his team to bring Rick's Morty along as well. Rick C-137 objects and tells them to leave his Morty out of this. The lead Rick responds that Rick C-137 lost the right to have a say when he refused to join the council. Beth asks what will happen to Jerry. Rick C-137 asks if they will at least unfreeze his daughter's idiot. The lead Rick unfreezes Jerry, who continues his panicked rant about offering his rare coin collection in exchange for mercy. Rick and Morty arrive at the Citadel of Ricks, the secret headquarters for the Council of Ricks. Morty asks what this place is. Rick explains that he has many enemies in the universe who consider his genius a threat. These enemies include galactic terrorists, subgalactic dictators, and most of the entire intergalactic government. Many versions of Rick across different timelines face the same problem. So, a few thousand versions of Rick had the idea of banding together like a herd of cattle or a school of fish. Morty notices a cowboy version of himself walking by. Rick tells him most timelines have a Rick, and most Ricks have a Morty. This place is a real who's who of who's you and me. The Citadel operates like a marketplace where Ricks sell products related to Mortys. One salesman tries to sell Morty Dazzlers to make boring old Mortys into hot fashion statements. Another Rick demonstrates a Morty doll that says, "Show me the Morty" when you press a button. A third Rick tries to sell Morty insurance. Rick C-137 tells him to back off and says this place is not his cup of tea. As they walk down a hallway toward the council chambers, Rick C-137 explains that the point of being a Rick is being a Rick. The armed Rick tells him to save his anti-Rick speech for the council. The council chambers are filled with Ricks, who serve as judges for this organization. The lead council member brings up holograms showing 27 Ricks who have been brutally murdered in their own timelines. He calls it an unprecedented Rickicidal epidemic. The council asks what Rick C-137 has to say about this. Rick C-137 asks if they really think he did this. He wants to know why he is the first Rick they pull in every time a Rick stubs his toe. The council member explains that Rick C-137 has a history of non-cooperation with the council. Rick C-137 points out that the scientist formerly known as Rick also refused to cooperate. He asks why that Rick is not here in handcuffs. The council member reveals that the scientist, formerly known as Rick, is also dead. The crowd of Ricks gasps in shock. The council asks who else they should question. Rick C-137 fits the profile perfectly. Of all the Ricks in the central finite curve, he is the malcontent and the rogue. Rick C-137 argues that he is the Rick, and so were all of them before they formed this alliance. They wanted to be safe from the government, so they became a government themselves. That makes every Rick here less Rick than him. Rick C-137 says they can murmur all they want, but he has pancakes back home with syrup on top. The council member decides that evidence is a good idea. He orders his team to scan Rick C-137's portal gun. One of the armed Ricks reaches into Rick C-137's lab coat and pulls out the portal gun. Rick C-137 protests that they should not look at another man's portal gun history because everyone goes to weird places. The council scans the device, and a diagram appears showing every location Rick C-137 has visited recently. The council member announces that Rick C-137 alone has been going to the exact timelines and locations where the murders occurred. The diagram highlights specific entries that flash red, matching the murder locations perfectly. Rick C-137 says this is ridiculous, and he is obviously being set up. The council sentences Rick C-137 to the machine of unspeakable doom, which swaps your conscious and unconscious minds, rendering your fantasies pointless, while everything you know becomes impossible to grasp. The machine also stabs your balls every 10 seconds. Rick C-137 decides he has heard enough. He elbows the guard holding him and tackles another guard, taking a gun. He shoots through his own handcuffs and then through Morty's handcuffs. Rick C-137 yells for Morty to run. They run down the corridor while armed Ricks chase them. Rick shoots portals into the side walls as they run. The pursuing Ricks get set on fire, attacked by insects, dragged into portals by tentacles, or hit by falling pumpkins. Rick and Morty reach the end of the corridor and leap over a railing. As they fall, Rick shoots a portal beneath them, and they fall through it. They escape through multiple bizarre dimensions. They land in Butt World, where everything is made of giant butt-shaped mountains. They run through a portal between two butt cheeks. The chase continues through a pizza dimension, where sentient pizzas sit on couches, making phone calls. One pizza orders a large person with extra people. They escape through Greasy Grandma World, where the dimension is filled with greasy grandmas everywhere. They continue through a phone dimension, where sentient phones sit on pizzas. One phone orders a large sofa chair with extra chair. Rick shoots several portals into one wall and enters the last one. The pursuing Ricks arrive, but do not know which portal to follow. Rick and Morty emerge in a chair dimension where sentient chairs live normal lives. Rick says this will keep the other Ricks busy for a while. Morty asks if Rick would really kill other versions of himself. Rick asks how that could possibly profit him. Someone out there is killing Ricks, and the council will not stop thinking it is him until they clear their names by finding the real Rick killer. Morty suggests they go home and stockpile weapons like doomsday preppers. Rick says that is not his style. Besides, Morty's home is most likely swarming with Ricks right now. Back at the Smith house, multiple Ricks and Mortys search the place. One Rick tells Jerry that if Rick calls, a device will trace his location. Jerry just needs to keep him on the phone for 30 seconds or longer. Beth brings lemonade to the Ricks, and they all praise her. The phone rings and Jerry answers. Rick tells Jerry that he and Morty are going to fly the spaceship into a black hole. Jerry panics. One Rick announces the call is coming from inside the house. All the Ricks laugh at Jerry for falling for the prank. Rick and Morty sit in a restaurant in the chair dimension. Morty tells Rick that when he first saw all those Ricks and Mortys, he thought it devalues their bond. But then he realized their relationship must be pretty special to span over all those different timelines. Rick responds that it has to be that way because Morty is camouflage. Morty asks what he means. Rick explains that Ricks have a very distinct and traceable brainwave due to their genius. The best way to hide from an enemy's radar is to stand near someone with complementary brainwaves. When a Rick is with a Morty, the genius waves get canceled out by the Morty waves. Rick suddenly realizes his portal gun was hacked remotely by the real killer to frame him, but he was able to trace the signal. They fly through space in a stolen police hovercraft. Rick mentions that it is good the space outlet had lab coats and Morty's favorite shirt in stock. Rick comments that this place is way off the grid. This guy does not want to be found. In the distance, they see a large dome structure covered in naked Mortys who are strapped to the surface. Contraptions stab their sides constantly, causing them to scream in agony. Morty asks why someone would do something so horrible. Rick explains that one Morty is enough to hide from the bureaucrats, but if you get a whole matrix of Mortys and put them in agonizing pain, that creates a pattern that can hide even from other Ricks. Rick says he fiddled with a concept like this once on paper only. He would never actually do this because it is barbaric overkill. Back at the Smith house, a different Rick enters and greets Jerry. This Rick asks what Jerry does for work. Jerry says he is between advertising jobs. The Rick expresses amazement that Jerry helps people figure out what to buy. Jerry says it is more complicated than that. The Rick says Jerry seems like a guy who really has it all together. Jerry asks if the Rick is being a jerk. The Rick says he would not want to offend Jerry. Other Ricks return and laugh at Jerry hanging out with Doofus Rick. Doofus Rick protests that he is Rick, J19 Zeta 7. One Rick asks if that is the timeline where everybody eats poop. Doofus Rick insists he does not eat poop. Jerry tells him that if he has learned one thing, before you get anywhere in life, you have to stop listening to yourself. Jerry tells Doofus Rick that makes him the best Rick of them all. Inside the dome, Rick and Morty explore dark corridors. Morty tells Rick that he does not care about Morty at all. Morty is just a tool, just an object. Rick tells Morty to be quiet because they need to get the drop on the guy. Morty says he is more than a human shield. Rick says Morty is a perfect, impenetrable suit of human armor because he is as dumb as Rick is smart. Lobster-like aliens emerge and surround them. Rick starts attacking the aliens, but more surround them. Evil Rick and Evil Morty emerge. Evil Rick slow claps. Rick C-137 asks if he is really doing the slow clap because that is played out. Evil Rick says he invented it in this dimension. The lobster aliens apprehend Rick and Morty. Evil Rick orders his minions to take Rick C-137's Morty away. Evil Morty tells Morty C-137 to come with him. They walk down a corridor together. Morty asks if they can shut down the grid and rescue the Mortys outside. Evil Morty responds that it would be pointless because Mortys have no chance of defeating a Rick. He opens a door and tells Morty to go inside. The room is filled with scared, shivering Mortys. Morty tries to leave, but Evil Morty closes the door and locks it. Rick C-137 wakes up tied to an examination table in Evil Rick's laboratory. Evil Rick presses a button that allows the sounds of Morty screaming to come through. He conducts the sounds like music. Evil Rick activates a display showing all the Ricks arranged on a spectrum from most evil to least evil. He shows Rick where they both rank. Evil Rick says he is simply going to download the contents of Rick C-137's brain and then kill him. In the Morty prison, Morty C-137 meets religious Mortys who worship the one true Morty. Morty C-137 tells all the Mortys to listen up. His name is Morty Smith from Earth Dimension C-137. They are Mortys, and they are not defined by their relationships to Rick. Their destiny is their own. One Morty says this sounds like something the one true Morty might say. The religious Morty declares that Morty C-137 is the one true Morty. The door opens and a lobster alien tells them to keep it down. All the Mortys rush the door and break free. In Evil Rick's laboratory, Evil Rick reviews Rick C-137's memories. The memories show various moments featuring Morty. Rick C-137 tears up. Evil Rick asks if Rick is crying over a Morty. The Mortys break through the door and rush at Evil Rick. They kill the lobster aliens and surround Evil Rick, tearing into him. Evil Rick tells them to kill him. The Mortys overwhelm him, and Evil Rick dies. Morty C-137 unbuckles Rick from the table. Rick presses a button that releases the Mortys from the torture grid outside. Ricks from the Citadel arrive and pull the Mortys off Evil Rick's corpse. The Council apologizes to Rick C-137 for the false accusation. Outside the Citadel, Rick and Morty walk away. Morty says he did a great job back there for a human cloaking device. Rick tells Morty not to break an arm, jerking himself off. Morty wants Rick to show a little humanity and connect with him. Rick says maybe he does not connect because he is the Rickest Rick there is. The Rickest Rick would have the Mortiest Morty. Back at Evil Rick's laboratory, two Ricks inspect the body. One Rick turns evil Rick's head over to reveal wires. They remove the top of his head to reveal electronics woven into his brain. They pull out a chip. One Rick recognizes this technology. Evil Rick was being controlled remotely, puppeteered by somebody else. This is the receiver, but where is the transmitter? At the Citadel, Mortys are being loaded into spaceships to be delivered home. Evil Morty follows them and removes his eye patch, revealing the transmitter underneath. He crushes it underfoot and hides the wires, then follows the rest of the Mortys onto the ships. The real killer escapes, completely undetected, by pretending to be just another victim. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Candidate Morty and the Morty Party campaign. Years after the events at Evil Rick's dome, the Citadel of Ricks has been rebuilt and restructured following the destruction Rick C-137 caused when he murdered the entire Council of Ricks. The Citadel now operates as a democratic society, where Ricks and Mortys live and work together in a massive city. The society remains deeply divided between Ricks who hold most positions of power and Mortys who occupy lower status roles. Into this divided world steps a candidate who promises to change everything. He is Candidate Morty, the leader of the Morty Party, and he is running for president of the Citadel. The rebuilt Citadel shows clear signs of the class divisions that exist in this society. Ricks work construction jobs, rebuilding damaged structures from the previous council's fall. Campaign manager Morty tries to hail a cab, but it passes him by to pick up a Rick in a business suit instead. At the police academy, Cop Rick trains with other Rick officers at a shooting range. At Morty Academy, a line of Mortys grab their books from lockers that all feature pictures of Jessica, while teacher Rick watches over them. On the morning commute train, many Ricks pull out flasks and take drinks at the exact same time. Rick J, 22, looks out the window and sees a wealthy Rick flying by in a luxury car, enjoying sardines and champagne. He sighs at the contrast between their lives. The Citadel Morning News broadcasts each morning with anchors Rick D, 716 and Rick D, 716B. They report on upcoming stories, including gravity outages in East Sanchez Heights and warnings about uranium-powered cellular matrices making people sick. A commercial break shows an advertisement for Simple Rick's wafer cookies. The commercial explains that 16 iterations off the central finite curve, there is a Rick who works more with wood than polarity plating. His name is Simple Rick, and he realized long ago that the greatest thing he would ever create was his daughter. The commercial shows footage of Simple Rick filming young Beth blowing out candles on her birthday cake. Beth says she loves Daddy, and Simple Rick smiles and cries happily. The narrator explains that they captured that moment and run it on a loop through Simple Rick's mind. An older Simple Rick sits in a seat at the wafer factory with the birthday scene playing on a helmet in a loop. He is attached to machinery that collects the happy secretions from his brain. The chemical that makes his brain secrete goes into every Simple Rick's simple wafer cookie. The commercial encourages viewers to come home to the impossible flavor of their own completion. The news broadcast returns with an update on the presidential election. Just one day remains before the newly democratic Citadel elects its first president. The race is wide open among the Rick candidates. The candidates include Retired General Rick, Private Sector Rick, Juggling Rick, Rick Guilt Rick, and Reverse Rick Outrage. Rick D, 716B, mentions that a certain other candidate should be getting at least one vote for Most Adorable. The screen shows Candidate Morty visiting hospitalized Mortys for photo opportunities. Rick D, 716 comments that the Morty Party candidate is still in the race and you just have to love him for that. Footage shows Candidate Morty standing outside a van, waving to the press. Rick D, 716 describes him in his little Morty suit waving and calls him adorable. He adds the words "little jackass" at the end. More footage shows Candidate Morty giving a speech to a crowd of Mortys in front of a commemorative Morty statue. Rick D, 716B claims they have the audio for his speech and makes up fake dialogue, saying Candidate Morty is whining about losing the election. Both news anchors laugh at their own joke. At Morty campaign headquarters, the Morty campaign staff watches the news report. Campaign manager Morty turns off the television. He tells Candidate Morty that they had a good run, but he thinks it is time to pull out of the race. Candidate Morty responds that he feels pretty confident about tonight's debate. Campaign manager Morty says Candidate Morty should not feel confident. He should be terrified instead. Candidate Morty suggests that campaign manager Morty should find a little faith. Candidate Morty walks away and campaign manager Morty calls after him. He points out that candidate Morty does not pay him to have faith. He also adds that they are the same age. The presidential debate takes place that evening, with all 6 candidates standing at podiums. Moderator Rick asks each candidate questions about their policy positions. Retired General Rick is asked how he would address the Citadel's problems. He responds with 2 words: more lasers. Moderator Rick tells him he can take more time to answer the question if he wants. Retired General Rick remains silent. Moderator Rick moves on to Juggling Rick and asks how he would solve the Citadel's financial crisis. Juggling Rick says first he wants to state that he thinks this Citadel is the greatest in the entire multiverse. He believes the answer has 3 parts. He reveals he is holding 3 balls. First, education spending must get much higher. He starts tossing 1 ball, but it has to be balanced with defense. He starts juggling all 3 balls. Behind the scenes, campaign manager Morty watches on a screen. He asks if they can fact-check this, then gives up and says the race is over. Juggling Rick is now juggling 3 balls and a chainsaw. He catches them all gracefully and declares, "That is how you run a Citadel." He bows and the audience cheers loudly. Moderator Rick turns to candidate Morty for the final question. He points out that the number of displaced Mortys is soaring while Rick's satisfaction levels are plummeting. The divide between the 2 groups has never been wider. He smirks and tells candidate Morty to solve that one real quick. The audience laughs at the question, but candidate Morty remains calm. He says he does not see a divide between Ricks and Mortys. Retired General Rick sarcastically says, "Oh, what a shocker," and farts. Reverse Rick Outrage says he would like to offer a rebuttal and farts. Rick Guilt. Rick tells the gentleman that he thinks they can all agree on one thing, and farts twice. He clarifies, it came out as 2 things, but they get the idea. All the Rick candidates laugh, except for candidate Morty. He asks if they are finished. He continues his speech by saying the division he sees is between the Ricks and Mortys that like the Citadel divided, and the rest of them. He sees it everywhere he goes. While candidate Morty speaks, the episode shows other scenes happening across the Citadel. Candidate Morty says he sees the division in the schools, where they teach Mortys that they are all the same because the system is threatened by what makes them unique. The scene shows Slick, Glasses Morty, Lizard Morty, and Fat Morty sneaking out of their school through a window. Candidate Morty says he sees it in the streets, where they give guns to Mortys, so they are too busy fighting each other to fight real injustice. The scene shows Cop Rick and Cop Morty driving up to see one of the Mortytown locos walking into an alleyway. Cop Morty slides the top of his laser gun. Candidate Morty says he sees it in the factories where Ricks work for a fraction of their boss's salary, even though they are identical and have the same IQ. The scene shows Rick J22 working at his post in the wafer factory. He becomes enraged, breaks off a piece of machinery to use as a weapon, and enters Supervisor Rick's office, where Supervisor Rick is watching the debate. Rick J22 shoots Supervisor Rick to death. He then sees numerous Ricks witnessing his actions through the office window. Candidate Morty says the Citadel's problem is not homeless Mortys or outraged Ricks. Rick J22 says, "Holy shit," as the alarm rings. He runs out of the office and enters the Flavor Core chamber. A Rick worker yells that Rick J22 is headed for the Flavor Core. Rick J22 puts the chamber on lockdown and activates a red force field barrier around the chamber. He encounters Simple Rick sitting in front of him. Candidate Morty continues his speech, saying the Citadel's problem is the Ricks and Mortys feeding on the Citadel's debt, but he has a message for them from the Ricks and Mortys keeping it alive. A message from the Ricks and Mortys that believe in this Citadel to the Ricks and Mortys that do not. You are outnumbered. The debate audience bursts into applause. The speech has completely changed the trajectory of the race. Candidate Morty walks backstage where campaign manager Morty waits for him. Campaign manager Morty cannot believe what just happened. He says he does not believe it. Candidate Morty agrees and puts a hand on his shoulder. He says that is why campaign manager Morty is fired. Candidate Morty walks away. Campaign manager Morty looks hurt and shocked. Juggling Rick approaches him and says it sounds like campaign manager Morty is looking for work. Juggling Rick can offer him a very enticing compensation package. He sets down a bag and unzips it, pulling out 3 juggling clubs. First, they should talk about benefits. Later that evening, campaign manager Morty sits alone at a bar drinking. The press conference with candidate Morty plays on the television. A reporter Rick asks candidate Morty what his original reality is and where his Rick is. Candidate Morty responds that they moved around so much it is hard to remember. He sees every Rick as his Rick. Campaign manager Morty asks the bartender for another drink with less water. Bartender Morty is fixing a new drink. He tells campaign manager Morty to cheer up because a Morty is going to be president. He gestures to the television and says, "Imagine this face getting blamed for everything." Bartender Morty walks away. Campaign manager Morty says he guesses he should have had more faith. A voice speaks from a few seats down the bar. Investigator Rick tells him it is not faith he needs, but fear. Investigator Rick takes out a dossier from inside his trench coat and slides it over to campaign manager Morty. Campaign manager Morty takes it uncertainly and asks what this is. Investigator Rick drains his glass and tells him it is secrets. What does campaign manager Morty think it is? Investigator Rick gets up and walks away, telling campaign manager Morty to look at how he is dressed. On the television, a Rick reporter asks candidate Morty if he is afraid at all for his safety by taking on the system like this. Campaign manager Morty pulls out the documents from the dossier and looks them over. Candidate Morty says on television that he would rather live in hope than fear. Campaign manager Morty looks shocked at what he sees in the documents. He looks up at the television. Candidate Morty continues saying, if he had to fear anything, he would fear other people being afraid of fear itself. Campaign manager Morty stares at the television with a disturbed expression on his face. The next day, candidate Morty greets crowds of Ricks behind crowd control barriers outside the Hard Rick Cafe. His bodyguard Ricks accompany him. He greets people warmly, shaking hands and making small talk. A plumber, Rick tells candidate Morty that he is a plumber. He emphasizes that he is a Rick and he is a plumber. Candidate Morty asks if that sounds like Rick work. The plumber did not come to the Citadel to be a plumber, did he? Plumber Rick laughs joyfully and says he sure did not. A Rick wearing a blue shirt and carrying a Rick baby comes forward. He tells candidate Morty that he cloned himself so candidate Morty can kiss him as a baby. Candidate Morty says this is just like a Morty baby. Every Rick cheers as candidate Morty kisses the Rick baby and gives him back to the father. Candidate Morty then sees a very displeased campaign manager Morty standing behind the barrier. Candidate Morty greets him warmly and they shake hands. He asks campaign manager Morty if he ended up getting a new job. Campaign manager Morty confirms that he did get a new job, assassinating candidate Morty. Campaign manager Morty holds up a laser pistol and shoots candidate Morty in the chest. One bodyguard Rick shoots his taser gun at campaign manager Morty, who screams horribly as electricity courses through his body. The other bodyguard Rick tends to candidate Morty as he starts bleeding heavily on the floor. Candidate Morty says he is okay repeatedly before falling unconscious. The assassination attempt shocks the entire Citadel. Despite being shot in the chest and bleeding profusely, candidate Morty survives the attack. The election proceeds as scheduled, and candidate Morty wins in a landslide victory. The news reports that it was a blowout, though one bodyguard Rick later says it was almost close enough to trigger a recount. Candidate Morty becomes President Morty, the first Morty to ever hold the position of president of the Citadel. Meanwhile, campaign manager Morty has been badly beaten up by security forces. Two bodyguard Ricks drag him down a hallway and throw him into an airlock chamber. Campaign manager Morty gets himself up and wipes a bloodstain off his face. He says candidate Morty has to be stopped. He could not be allowed to win. Bodyguard Rick, one tells him that if those were his goals, campaign manager Morty should have worked on his aim. Campaign manager Morty asks if candidate Morty is alive. He says no repeatedly and tells them they have to listen to him. He shows them his campaign badge. He worked for candidate Morty as his campaign manager. That Morty is not what he seems. Bodyguard Rick too responds that no Morty seems like a president. Campaign manager Morty asks if candidate Morty won the election. Bodyguard Rick too confirms that he did. The airlock door closes. Campaign manager Morty immediately brings out the documents from the dossier and cries out to the bodyguard Ricks, but they cannot hear him through the sealed door. Bodyguard Rick 1 says it was a blowout. He pushes a button on the airlock panel, and campaign manager Morty is instantly sucked out into space, along with the dossier and all its contents. Campaign manager Morty dies immediately in the vacuum of space. Bodyguard Rick 2 says they can hardly call it a blowout because it was almost close enough to trigger a recount. Bodyguard Rick 1 asks if the other Rick is joke security now too. President Morty prepares to meet with the true power behind the Citadel. While the Council of Ricks previously served as the public face of Citadel government, a shadow council has always controlled things behind the scenes. These wealthy and powerful Ricks have been running the Citadel since before the council existed. They meet in a private hall where they make the real decisions that shape Citadel policy. Rick D. Sanchez III, owner of the Simple Rick's wafer factory, arrives to take his seat at the table next to Steve Jobs' Rick. He apologizes for being late and says he had a little crisis at work. Steve Jobs' Rick tells him it was worth it and eats a Simple Rick wafer cookie. The council members watch as Barber Rick gives President Morty a haircut. President Morty asks Barber Rick to take a little more off the top. He then asks Garment District Rick to continue what he was saying. Garment District Rick addresses President Morty directly. He uses air quotes around the title President Morty. He says they do not care who sits in that seat. A Rick, a Morty, or even a Jerry. It does not matter. They have been running the Citadel since before the council existed, and President Morty will find that they are still running it now. President Morty turns around holding a mirror. He asks if Garment District Rick really speaks for everyone here. The other Ricks confirm that he does speak for them. President Morty turns back around, still holding up the mirror. He says he thinks it is important to be clear. He asks everyone to raise their hand if Garment District Rick speaks for them. Through the reflection in President Morty's mirror, 7 Ricks raise their hands. These include Rick D, Sanchez III, and Garment District Rick. President Morty snaps his fingers. 2 Officer Ricks immediately enter and use shock lasers to kill all 7 Ricks who raise their hands. The Ricks die instantly and collapse in their chairs. Steve Jobs, Rick, and good-looking Rick did not raise their hands and remain alive. Barber Rick keeps his cool and asks if that is enough off the top. 3 more Officer Ricks enter the room. President Morty turns to face the 2 remaining living Ricks. He asks if it is enough. Steve Jobs' Rick begs and says yes. Goddamn yes. Good-looking Rick also begs and says yes, it is great. President Morty simply responds good. Officer Ricks and Mortys begin carrying the Rick corpses out of the room. President Morty walks over to pour himself a glass of brandy. He looks out the window and begins speaking. He says this seems like a good time for a drink and a cold, calculated speech with sinister overtones. A speech about politics, about order, brotherhood, and power. The episode shows scenes of the changes taking place across the Citadel under President Morty's rule. New banners featuring Morty and Rick symbols cover the old Rick emblems on buildings. Cop Rick puts on his new police badge with updated insignia. Fat Morty, Glasses Morty, and Lizard Morty push wheelbarrows full of megafruit in their new work uniforms. Officer Ricks drag the remaining dead Shadow Council Ricks into airlock pods. President Morty continues his speech, saying that speeches are for campaigning. Now is the time for action. Outside the Citadel in the vacuum of space, 4 dead Ricks are ejected from an airlock. These include Rick D, Sanchez III, and Garment District Rick. The song For the Damaged Coda begins playing. The camera zooms out to reveal dozens of dead Ricks and Mortys floating in space around the Citadel. The bodies include Cop Morty, who was killed earlier in the episode by his partner Cop Rick. Big Morty, who ran the criminal operations in Mortytown, is also floating dead. Investigator Rick, who gave campaign manager Morty the secret dossier, floats among the corpses. Campaign manager Morty's body drifts in space as well. Most importantly, the floating documents from the dossier are visible. The papers show photographs that reveal the truth about President Morty's identity. One photograph shows a Morty with an eye patch. Another photograph shows candidate Morty removing his eye patch next to a puppet-controlled Rick. The documents confirm that President Morty is the same evil Morty who appeared years earlier, controlling evil Rick with technology hidden behind his eye patch. The Morty who orchestrated the murder of 27 Ricks and framed Rick C-137 has now become the president of the entire Citadel. The photographs float away off-screen and drift into the void of space. Nobody on the Citadel knows the truth about their new president's identity or his past crimes. The episode ends by returning to Rick and Morty C-137. They teleport back into the garage, wearing full scuba gear, after their adventure in Atlantis. Rick celebrates enthusiastically about their trip. Morty says it was amazing. They take off their snorkels and flippers. Rick brags about getting some mermaid puss. Morty says he is really hoping it was not a one-off thing, and he can see her again. He then asks Rick if he is still not curious about what might have happened at that crazy Citadel place. Rick takes seaweed off his pants and says not at all. That place will never have any bearing over their lives ever again. Unlike that mermaid puss, he celebrates and says they are going back for seconds. They are going to do that every week. That was Atlantis. Morty continues celebrating along with Rick, completely unaware that the Citadel has just come under the control of one of their most dangerous enemies. President Morty now controls the entire infrastructure of the Citadel, including its police force, its schools, its factories, and its government. He has systematically eliminated everyone who stood in his way. He killed his own campaign manager to silence him. He executed the entire Shadow Council of Ricks who thought they could control him. He has consolidated absolute power and replaced the old order with his own vision for the Citadel. The Citadel's transformation under President Morty represents a complete shift in how the society operates. Where Ricks once dominated every aspect of life, Mortys now have positions of authority and power. The police force has been reorganized with new badges and protocols. The schools have changed their curriculum, though teacher Rick mentions he does not know what the new curriculum will be before he gets fired. The factory systems continue operating, but under new oversight. The political structure has been completely dismantled and rebuilt according to President Morty's specifications. Every institution that made up the old Citadel has been reformed. The Ricks and Mortys living on the Citadel do not fully understand what has happened. They know they elected a Morty president in what seemed like a democratic process. They do not know that their president systematically murdered everyone who might expose his true identity or challenge his authority. The bodies floating in space tell a different story than the one President Morty presents to his citizens. Evil Morty's plan succeeded completely. Years earlier, he murdered 27 Ricks and kidnapped their Mortys to create his torture grid. He framed Rick C-137 for the crimes. He escaped detection by hiding the transmitter behind his eye patch and blending in with the other Morty victims. He then disappeared into the multiverse and waited for the right opportunity. When the Citadel needed to rebuild after Rick C-137 destroyed the Council, Evil Morty saw his chance. He returned under a new identity as Candidate Morty. He built a political movement based on real grievances that Mortys experienced under Rick rule. His speech at the debate resonated because it spoke to genuine problems in Citadel society. The schools did teach Mortys they were all the same. The police did give guns to Mortys who ended up fighting each other. The factories did pay Rick workers a fraction of what their identical Rick bosses earned. Evil Morty took these real issues and used them to build popular support. But his campaign was never about actually helping Mortys or Ricks. The entire presidential run was a calculated move to seize power. He fired campaign manager Morty the moment his speech succeeded because he no longer needed him. When campaign manager Morty received evidence of his true identity and tried to assassinate him, Evil Morty survived and used the attack to generate even more sympathy. He won the election by an overwhelming margin. Then he immediately revealed his true nature by executing the Shadow Council. The speech he gave while the bodies were carried away showed his real personality: cold, calculated, ruthless, and completely in control. He talked about speeches being for campaigning, while now being the time for action. The action he took was systematic murder of anyone who might threaten his power. The documents floating in space provide the only evidence of Evil Morty's true identity. They show him removing his eye patch next to the puppet-controlled Rick from years earlier. They prove that President Morty and the Morty who controlled Evil Rick are the same person. But those documents are drifting in the vacuum of space along with the body of campaign manager Morty, who tried to expose the truth. Investigator Rick, who compiled the evidence, is also dead. Everyone who knew President Morty's secret has been eliminated. The new president has complete control over the Citadel, and nobody left alive knows who he really is or what he is capable of doing. His rise to power represents one of the most successful long-term plans ever executed in the Rick and Morty universe. Evil Morty played the long game, waited for years, returned under a false identity, manipulated democratic processes, and seized absolute control of the most powerful organization in the multiverse. He accomplished all of this while Rick C-137 was off having adventures in Atlantis, completely unaware that his old enemy had just become the most powerful Morty in existence. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, President Morty explains the central finite curve. Rick C-137 and Morty arrive at the Citadel to fix a problem with an aging serum that made Morty 40 years old. After getting the age reversed at a Rebuild-A-Morty store, they witness chaos in the streets. A deformed Morty emerges from the sewers, spray painting "End of Days" on a wall. Police Mortys wrestle with him. An adult version of their Morty, who was created during the reversal process, tries to help but gets shot by police. The deformed Morty grabs a gun and tries to warn everyone that death is coming and the Citadel is a weapon of mass destruction. Before he can finish, a police Morty shoots him in the head and kills him. Rick wants to leave immediately before things get political, but a Secret Service car pulls up. Several Rick agents get out and tell Rick C-137 that President Morty requests he join him for dinner. Morty gets excited about having dinner with the Morty president. Rick reminds Morty that he destroyed this place before. The Secret Service Rick says Rick has been pardoned for that. Morty begs Rick to go. Rick warns that the Citadel runs on canon, meaning serialized storytelling with consequences. Morty insists they should go. Rick agrees, but says the second President Morty reveals he is evil, they are leaving immediately. Rick and Morty sit at a dining table facing each other with a roast dinner laid out. Morty tastes Rick's food to test for poison. He says it tastes pretty good. Rick takes the plate back and tells Morty to let him know if he starts feeling poisony. He says it is good to have Morty back. President Morty arrives late and apologizes, saying work never really ends. Rick comments that they really did make a Morty the president. President Morty says he hates them every day for it, but he expresses excitement about Rick C-137 being there. He jokes that he hopes Rick is not here to blow the place up again. Rick jokes back that he might if President Morty tries to keep him there. President Morty says he would not dream of it, but he mentions it is amazing Rick dropped by because President Morty was eventually going to hunt Rick down. Rick immediately draws his gun and says there is the reveal. Morty objects and says the guy got elected president by Rick's and Morty's and is being really nice. Rick puts his gun away but says all politicians are nice. President Morty calls Rick a hot bag of peanuts. Morty tries to explain that they have been through a lot, and Rick does not like serialized drama. Rick confirms he prefers to keep things episodic because Ricks never look back. President Morty agrees that is a waste of a legend in Rick's case since Rick practically built this place. Morty asks what President Morty means by that. Rick changes the subject and asks about the deformed Mortys coming up through the sewer lines, talking about hope and change. President Morty acknowledges that is fair criticism. Morty compliments Rick's clapback and asks President Morty what the deal is with those Mortys. President Morty explains he has a little project going on that acquired some hands-on labor. It would require less labor if Rick were willing to tell him how one might bring down the central finite curve. Rick immediately says it is time to go. Morty wants to know what President Morty is talking about. President Morty asks if Rick can give him 10 more seconds. Rick says literally 10 seconds, because now it would be 6. President Morty says he is fine with that and counts down to 1. Suddenly, a brain-scanning device pops out from a hidden compartment in the table. President Morty takes it and turns on the device to examine Rick's memories. President Morty says it would have been a big help for Rick to tell him what he needed, but he should have everything from Rick's brain now. Rick protests that you cannot scan an entire brain over appetizers. President Morty responds that most of Rick's brain got scanned a long time ago. Restraints pop out from the chairs and pin Rick and Morty in place. President Morty says Rick probably does not remember when this happened. The scene pauses, and a Stan Lee version of Rick appears. He tells viewers to check out Season 1, Episode 9, and says, Excelsior. The scene resumes with Rick realizing President Morty is talking about evil Rick from their first encounter. Morty says they kicked evil Rick's ass. President Morty says he loves that they called him Evil Rick. He calls Rick the smartest man in the universe with an ego so big you could just grab it like a joystick. The brain scanner deactivates and President Morty examines the data. He confirms it looks complete. He says he was afraid he would have to kill every Rick on the Citadel to get what he needed. Morty is angry and says he vouched for President Morty. Rick only came here because Morty asked him to. Morty apologizes to Rick. Rick says that apology and a screwdriver in his hand would be worth a screwdriver. President Morty says, sell out Mortys, kill him. He would hate them more than the Ricks they worship if there was any point, but they cannot help it because they were bred for it. He asks if they want to see. President Morty jams the spike on the brain scanner into Morty's neck. Morty's eyes glaze over as memories are beamed directly into his brain. The memories show the exterior of Evil Rick's fortress with the Morty shield outside from years earlier. President Morty's voice narrates what Morty is seeing. He says Morty already knows that Rogue Ricks used Mortys to hide themselves from the Citadel, but Morty might not know it worked so well that the Citadel became its own Morty market. The memories show several Ricks scanning universes and identifying Beth's and Jerry's. In one universe, a Rick taps Beth's shoulder while she is in a library. She sees Jerry and the two strike up a conversation. In another universe, a teenage Jerry is in a school canteen with a lunch tray, while teenage Beth talks with her friends. Both are shot with darts laced with love serum. Jerry slips over and Beth topples onto the floor next to him. They instantly bond with each other due to the serum. President Morty continues narrating. He says he is sure Morty does not know how far the Ricks have gone to help supply meat demand. Sure, Ricks could scour infinity for naturally occurring grandsons, but why bother? So much work, such an admission of need. The memory shows a Rick taking a blood sample from a Morty. Then it cuts to a cloning factory that produces Mortys. Several naked Mortys are shown in a cage. The cage opens and a screaming Morty is sent down a slide. He gets dressed in his casual attire and a helmet is put on his head. The helmet is activated by a Rick, brainwashing the Morty with an old Morty's memories. Then the Morty is sent through a portal to join that Morty's Rick as a replacement. President Morty says there are not infinite versions of their grandfather. Rick is an infinite smear of one shitty old man, and he is attached to them infinitely through his weakness and their forgiveness. This is why they are with him. This is why they are alive. The memory repeats, showing Mortys being brainwashed and sent to replace dead Mortys across a network of universes arranged in a yellow curve. The flashback ends on the Morty factory as Morty comes back to consciousness. Morty asks what the fuck just happened. He tells Rick to say this is not true. Rick admits it is not the whole truth. Both Morty and President Morty call Rick a liar at the same time. Rick says it is complicated. Morty says he is not busy and wants to hear the explanation. Rick changes the subject by reminding Morty that all he said he needed was an apology and a screwdriver in his hand. He forgot he literally has a screwdriver in his hand. He calls himself basically Inspector Gadget. Rick frees himself, jumps onto the table, and runs across to Morty. He aims his gun at President Morty. Rick takes a shot, but it is blocked by a force field. He frees Morty as two Rick guards draw their guns. President Morty calmly says Rick is free to go. He calls Rick the Rickest Rick and says they will never see him again. Rick opens a portal to leave but stops. He turns back and sees President Morty with a smug grin. Rick gets suspicious. He asks Morty if he refilled the portal gun when he came here for the serum. Morty confirms he did. Rick grabs a guard and shoves him into the portal. The guard yelps as he falls through, and blood spurts out the portal. The coordinates were locked to the blender dimension, where everything gets blended up instantly. Morty says, "Holy shit." Rick says he only knows one man that ever hacked his portal gun, and it turned out it was evil Morty. President Morty celebrates and says Rick is all caught up. President Morty pushes a button on a remote control. 4 elite Rick guards drop down from the ceiling. Rick tells them to hold it. He fills a syringe with his blood, then spurts it onto the floor. He throws a test tube of purple liquid onto it. The liquid reacts with the blood and creates a fleshy, tumor-covered clone of Rick. Morty asks who that is. Rick says it is time for Big Boy and tells Morty to duck. The guards all attack Rick, but their attacks are blocked by an orange force field. The damage is redirected to Big Boy, who begins moaning in pain as he takes the full force of the attacks. Morty asks if Big Boy likes it. Rick says Big Boy is a metaphor for capitalism, so what does Morty think? Using the stored energy from Big Boy, Rick gains a surge of power and easily takes out the guards. He busts the door down and defeats the rest of the guards outside. Big Boy then explodes because he cannot take any more damage. Rick grabs the brain scanner from across the room using an extendable hand. President Morty says Rick cannot outrun his past. As Rick and Morty turn to run, Rick takes another shot at President Morty. The force field blocks it again. President Morty asks if Rick thought the force field would be down the second time. Rick says he was expressing disapproval of President Morty's dialogue. Rick and Morty escape the room. President Morty laughs and says Rick can disapprove all he wants. Tonight, the quality of dialogue stops mattering. Tonight, President Morty does that thing he wants to do with the curve thing. The loudspeaker system throughout the Citadel announces that nobody should leave and everybody should stay. This message repeats over and over. Naturally, everyone is skeptical of this announcement. In the Citadel Plaza, a Rick attempts to leave with his portal gun. He is sucked into the Blender dimension and killed. The surrounding Ricks and Mortys hear his death scream, and this triggers a panic. Another Rick attempts to escape and meets the same fate. Two Mortys go for their portal guns. One is incinerated by a flamethrower on the other end of the portal. The other is grabbed by robot tentacles and torn in half. A Morty is sucked into a blending tube. A Rick is gunned down by a machine gun. Chaos erupts across the Citadel with fires spouting across the inner city. Many Ricks and Mortys die trying to escape. A broadcast of Citadel News plays with the headline, "We're fucked," displayed on screen. News anchor Rick D716 speaks during the broadcast. He says in uncertain times like these, he thinks it is important for him to say, "Eat shit," and "fuck you." The drug companies paid for him to say every word. He has millions of dollars, and he does not care. Rick D716 goes for his portal gun, but is grabbed by a tentacled alien on the other end. He screams as he is dragged through to his death. Rick D716B sits down at the news desk and says he would just like to say that prescription drugs are great and you should buy them now. Rick and Morty exit the presidential building as the Citadel descends into complete anarchy. Two Ricks are seen fighting each other while others are murdered by their own portal guns. Fires rage across the area as screaming fills the air. Morty asks Rick what is happening. Rick explains that President Morty hacked the entire city's portal supply. He says there still might be one way out of here, which is out the bottom. Rick puts on a laser visor that cuts a hole in the floor. Morty jumps into his arms and the two descend downward. Rick and Morty emerge underground and hide. They watch as Rick guards oversee portal fluid being manufactured in mines. Morty asks what Rick thinks President Morty needed from his brain. Rick assumes President Morty wanted schematics for the Citadel's dimensional drive. If President Morty is going to use it to blow the curve, they do not want to be here when that happens. Morty asks what the central finite curve is. Rick says they will do questions and answers after their survival. Hopefully, they can grab some untainted portal fluid at the source and get out of here. Just as Rick and Morty reach the portal fluid containers, all the fluid gets drained away. Rick says, or not. Rick and Morty descend down to see all the portal fluid being emptied into one large vat. They hear Morty's groaning in agony. Rick comments that he thought his capitalism metaphor was on the nose. The deformed Mortys are being made to work in the mines. A Rick oversees their work and whips them. Morty asks if Rick helped build the Citadel. He asks if Rick just lied to him about everything. Rick tells Morty to just sneak through the cave base. They turned a new leaf. They are back to simple adventures. Morty says it is not a new leaf until Rick tells him everything. Rick says they really do not have time for this because the whole place is going to blow up. Morty says no, he does not trust Rick anymore. He does not want to do this anymore if he is not going to get straight answers from Rick. Rick says God damn it and takes out the brain scanner. He tells Morty here is his downloaded brain. Morty wants to jump the shark and know Rick's stupid crybaby backstory. Rick tells him to knock himself out. Morty grabs the scanner and sticks it into his neck again. Rick says not now, but the flashback begins anyway. The flashback shows the jacket-wearing Rick killing C-137 Rick's wife Diane and daughter Beth as previously seen in an earlier episode called The Rickshank Rickdemption. Rick is rescued by an ambulance. Sometime later, after living a disheveled and lonely life, Rick is motivated to finish inventing the portal gun. He spends his days traveling between dimensions. During this time, he builds the space cruiser. He studies the flora and fauna of the universes he enters. He works as an arms dealer. He evades backstabbing buyers. Eventually, he decides to hunt for the Rick who killed his family. After spending some time with Bird Person, Rick begins traveling the multiverse and killing every alternate Rick he comes across trying to find his target. But he never finds the Rick who killed his family. This causes him to descend into a bitter, lonely, depressed, and alcoholic old man. As Rick sulks in his home universe, killing hostile Ricks left and right, a group of Ricks band together to form the Council of Ricks, hoping to stop him. After some time, C-137 Rick and the Citadel form a truce. C-137 Rick builds the Citadel for the other Ricks and promises not to kill any more of them. He then returns to his target Rick's universe, hoping to wait him out there. The flashback ends with Rick reuniting with a tearful Beth and Rick going on adventures with that universe's Morty, who is our Morty. Morty snaps back to reality. Rick has been carrying him during the memory viewing. Morty says, "Whoa," and mentions Rick had a dead wife. Rick says yes, and now everyone can shut up about it. Morty says he feels a lot better having seen all that. Rick sets Morty down in a dark room. The lights suddenly blink on. Evil Morty is there inside a glass pod. He says, of course, Morty feels better having seen Rick's backstory. In their minds, they are the underdog. Rick takes a shot at the glass, but it bounces off. Evil Morty says that is how they justify this. Evil Morty presses a button on a remote which creates a hologram of the central finite curve. It is a large spiral consisting of several yellow energy balls. Each ball represents a universe. The hologram shows each universe's Rick tormenting their Morty in various ways and being a general piece of shit. Among the images shown are a psychopathic Rick with a knife, a Rick massacring people with Crowhorse, a Rick surrounded by flames, and another Rick passed out drunk on a bed. Rick tells Morty he is not responsible for every fucked up Rick out there. Evil Morty responds that they literally all say that. They all have that excuse, and it is part of their system. None of them have to be responsible because they are all victims of themselves. Evil Morty sarcastically says, "Oh, it is so hard to be a genius," and asks, "Could you not just die?" Morty asks what Evil Morty is doing about all this. Evil Morty says, "Jack shit, he is leaving." He asks if they know what the central finite curve is. Evil Morty explains that the Ricks built a wall around infinity. They separated all the infinite universes from all the infinite universes where Rick is the smartest man in the universe. Every version of Rick and Morty has spent every version of all their lives in one infinite crib built around an infinite fucking baby. Various scenes from universes on the finite curve are shown. Rick sits at his workbench with a pained expression. Rick wears his king of shit crown. An injured Morty holds an injured Rick. Rick sadly sits down in a chair next to a device with a memory tube in it. Evil Morty says he is leaving the central finite curve. That is what makes him evil, being sick of Rick. If Morty has ever been sick of Rick, then Morty has been evil too. Morty asks Rick if he really left the crows for Morty or if he came back because the crows dumped him. Rick looks away and says nothing. Evil Morty tells Morty there he goes. Now Morty is Evil Morty too. Sooner or later, they all are on this side of the curve. Evil Morty puts on a cybernetic eye patch and presses a button. This activates the dimensional drive. It fires a beam which begins to open a wormhole. Outside on the Citadel, portal fluid bursts from the ground and sweeps away everything in its path. Explosions occur across the Citadel, which tilts on its axis. One Rick with an orange afro tells his Morty not to worry because they still have a way out nobody thought of called Operation Phoenix. His Morty asks if that still means death. The Rick pulls out a gun and hands it to his Morty. He says sure, but the joke is on them because they just found a back door to getting off this rock. The Morty shoots his Rick. A pillar falls on the Morty and crushes him to death. Orange Afro Morty opens his eyes in a vat as part of Operation Phoenix. A female computer voice says rerouted repeatedly. Ricks and Mortys wake up in vats with blender blades at the bottom. They are liquefied and the blood is sent to power the beam, opening a hole in the finite curve. The female computer voice continues, saying rerouted. The vats are shown to be in the chamber where Rick, Morty, and President Morty are standing. As the machine is fed blood from the liquefied Ricks and Mortys, the beam from the dimensional drive grows stronger. Morty says, "Oh my fucking god." Rick tells Morty they have to go. The room shakes and debris falls from the ceiling. Rick gets trapped underneath a heavy plank of wood. President Morty, now wearing a spacesuit, steps out of the glass dome around the control panel. A small spaceship is next to him. President Morty tells them they can come if they want, but not to blame him if they do not. Rick says, from where he sits, that is the best deal on the table. He does not have a real plan. Morty lifts the plank of wood off Rick. Rick gets to his feet and thanks Morty. He says he is glad Morty ignored his advice. President Morty says it is just as well because he lied. That second seat is a toilet. Morty says that is a super dick move, but weirdly kind of cool to admit. Rick comments that they really are bred for forgiveness. He tells Morty they should go. Rick and Morty run out of the chamber. Rick and Morty climb out of a manhole onto a Citadel street. Around them, deformed Mortys are crawling out from the sewers. A wave of portal fluid washes towards them. They all get on a train and head for a different part of the Citadel called Mortyburg. Rick, Morty, and all the other Mortys on the train get off when they arrive. Rick tells them to say goodbye to the Citadel. Rick presses a button labeled Disengage. The entrance to Mortyburg closes and an alarm sounds. The circular section of the Citadel separates from the main body and thrusters engage. The song, For the Damaged Coda, begins to play. A hole opens up in space behind them, sucking the detached portion of the Citadel towards it. Rick struggles to activate the boosters. Outside in space, the beam from the dimensional drive shuts off, leaving a rift in the curve. Inside the dimensional drive chamber, President Morty straps himself into the personal spaceship. The robotic arm holding the ship loads it into the exit chute. A pneumatic arm engages and shoots the spaceship out the bottom of the Citadel. President Morty approaches the rift in the central finite curve in his spaceship. Behind him, explosions erupt throughout the dimensional drive chamber. Back on the detached Mortyburg section, Rick is still struggling to engage the boosters. Then he sees a sign that says Booster Control must operate with partner. Rick offers his hand to Morty. He pulls Morty towards the control panel against the gravitational forces, pulling them backwards towards the rift in space. They activate the boosters together. Rick pulls his portal gun out of his pocket. There is no more fluid left in it. They both turn and watch the Citadel explode behind them. President Morty watches in awe as he breaks through the barrier of the central finite curve. Finally, his thrusters turn off and he is floating in the space between universes. He opens the front of the spaceship and presses a button on one of his wrist pads. A holographic representation of the central finite curve is projected into the air in front of him. The hologram bursts like miniature fireworks. President Morty takes out a golden portal gun and creates a golden-colored portal. He steps inside and the portal closes behind him. President Morty has successfully escaped the central finite curve and entered the wider multiverse that exists beyond the wall the Ricks built around infinity. The revelation of the central finite curve represents one of the most important pieces of information ever revealed in the show. For years, Rick presented himself as the smartest man in the universe, but Evil Morty's explanation reveals this was only true because the Ricks collectively built a wall separating all the infinite universes, where Rick is the smartest person from all the other infinite universes, where Rick might not be. Every Rick and every Morty has lived their entire existence inside this artificially created bubble. The central finite curve is not a natural structure of reality. It is a deliberately constructed barrier designed to protect Rick's ego. By separating themselves from universes where they might not be the smartest, the Ricks created a space where their superiority was guaranteed. This explains why Rick's portal gun only accesses certain universes. The technology was specifically designed to keep users inside the curve. The Citadel itself served as the infrastructure maintaining this system. When C-137 Rick helped build the Citadel, he created the tools that other Ricks used to maintain the central finite curve. The portal fluid mines, the dimensional drive, and the entire organizational structure of the Citadel existed to support this bubble reality. The deformed Mortys working in the mines were literally the slave labor powering the system. When they tried to warn people that the Citadel was a weapon of mass destruction, they were speaking the literal truth. The Citadel's dimensional drive had the power to break the central finite curve. Evil Morty simply reprogrammed it to do exactly that. Evil Morty's characterization of the situation as living in an infinite crib built around an infinite baby captures the fundamental dynamic. Every Rick across infinite universes shares the same basic personality traits and the same fundamental weakness. They need to feel superior. They need to be the smartest person around them. They cannot tolerate the existence of anyone who might be smarter. So they built a wall around infinity to ensure they would never have to face that possibility. And they trapped every Morty inside that wall with them. Mortys exist solely to serve Rick's needs. They hide Rick's brainwaves from detection. They provide emotional support. When they die, they get replaced with clones who have fake memories implanted. The entire system treats Mortys as disposable tools rather than as people. Evil Morty's plan to escape required enormous resources and careful preparation. He had to get elected president of the Citadel. He had to scan Rick C-137's brain to get the schematics for the dimensional drive. He had to reprogram every portal gun on the Citadel to trap everyone there. He had to use the Operation Phoenix resurrection system to liquefy Ricks and Mortys for fuel. He had to power the dimensional drive with enough energy to literally break through the barrier, separating the central finite curve from the wider multiverse. and he had to do all of this while keeping his true identity and intentions hidden. The moment he revealed himself to Rick and Morty, he had already completed every step of his plan except the final escape. By the time they understood what was happening, it was too late to stop him. Rick and Morty barely survived the Citadel's destruction. They only escaped because Rick found the one section designed to detach in an emergency. The Mortyberg section separated from the main Citadel with thrusters that could push them away from the rift Evil Morty created, but the boosters required 2 people to operate. Rick could not do it alone. He needed Morty's help to activate them. This represents a significant moment in their relationship. Throughout the episode, Rick tried to avoid dealing with the truth about their past and the systems he helped create. He wanted to keep things simple and episodic, but Morty forced him to confront reality. Morty saw Rick's memories and learned the truth about the Citadel, and when they faced death together, Rick acknowledged that Morty was right to demand honesty. The two of them activated the boosters together and survived as partners rather than as Rick, using Morty as a tool. Evil Morty's escape through the central finite curve changes everything about the show's universe. For the first time, a character has successfully left the bubble reality that contains all the Ricks. Evil Morty now exists in the true infinite multiverse, where Rick might not be special at all. There could be infinite beings smarter than Rick. There could be infinite civilizations more advanced than anything Rick has encountered. There could be infinite versions of Evil Morty himself. The golden portal gun he uses creates golden portals instead of the standard green, suggesting the technology functions differently outside the curve. Evil Morty has achieved something no Rick was willing to do. He left the comfortable bubble where Rick's superiority was guaranteed and entered true infinity where anything is possible. The cost of Evil Morty's escape was enormous. The entire Citadel was destroyed. Thousands of Ricks and Mortys died. Those who tried to escape through their portal guns were killed by whatever was on the other end after Evil Morty reprogrammed them. Those who used Operation Phoenix to respawn were liquefied for fuel. The dimensional drive chamber became a mass grave as the resurrection system fed victims directly into blenders. The explosion of the main Citadel section killed everyone who did not make it to Mortyberg in time. The rift Evil Morty created in the central finite curve pulled wreckage and bodies into it. The entire organizational structure that maintained order across infinite universes collapsed in a single night. Rick and Morty escaped with a handful of survivors, but they lost their portal gun fluid. They were stranded with no way to travel between universes until they could manufacture more. The revelation about the central finite curve recontextualizes every adventure Rick and Morty ever had. Every universe they visited was inside the bubble. Every Rick they met was part of the same artificially limited set. Every conflict, every alliance, every choice happened within the constraints the Ricks built around themselves. The show's infinite multiverse was never truly infinite. It was a curated selection designed to protect Rick's ego. Evil Morty called it an infinite crib built around an infinite baby. That baby is Rick. Every version of Rick across every universe shares the same fundamental flaw. They need to feel superior, they need to be the smartest, they will build walls around infinity itself, rather than risk encountering someone who might be smarter than them. This explains why Rick C-137 never found the Rick who killed his wife and daughter. That Rick might have been outside the central finite curve, or that Rick might have known the curve was being built and stayed outside it deliberately. C-137. Rick spent years traveling the multiverse, killing other Ricks trying to find his family's murderer, but he was only searching inside the bubble. He eventually gave up his hunt and helped build the Citadel. He helped create the very system that might have been protecting his enemy. The other Ricks convinced him to stop killing them and instead help them maintain their collective superiority. C-137. Rick built the Citadel, created its infrastructure, and then left to wait in his target's universe. He formed a truce with the system that might be harboring the person he wanted to kill more than anyone. Morty's reaction to learning all this information shows how much the truth changes everything. He saw Rick's tragic backstory about losing his wife and daughter. He saw Rick building the portal gun and spending years hunting for revenge. He saw Rick becoming an arms dealer and killing countless versions of himself, searching for one specific Rick. He saw Rick giving up and helping build the Citadel. He saw Rick returning to form a relationship with a different version of Beth. And he saw Rick choosing to take that Beth's son on adventures across the multiverse. Morty spent his whole life thinking he was special to Rick. He thought Rick chose him. But the memories reveal that Rick was just waiting for the right Beth to have a son of the right age. Our Morty happened to be available when Rick needed a Morty to hide his brainwaves. That is why Rick moved back in with his daughter and started going on adventures. Not because this Morty was special, but because a Morty of roughly the right age became available. The central finite curve revelation forces everyone to reconsider what it means to be Rick and Morty. Are they heroes exploring infinite possibilities? Or are they prisoners in a constructed reality designed to protect one man's ego? Are their adventures meaningful? Or are they just variations on the same basic patterns repeated infinite times inside a bubble? Evil Morty chose to leave because he was sick of the entire system. He did not want to reform the Citadel. He did not want to improve conditions for Mortys. He did not want to fight the Ricks for control. He wanted out completely. He wanted to leave the central finite curve and never come back. That is what made him evil in the eyes of the system. Not violence or cruelty, but the fundamental rejection of the entire framework that defines Rick and Morty's reality. Rick and Morty are now stranded in Mortyburg with a group of Mortys they saved. They have no portal gun fluid. The Citadel is destroyed. The central finite curve has been breached. The systems that define their reality have collapsed. They have to figure out how to survive in this new situation, where the old rules no longer apply. Rick can no longer rely on the Citadel's infrastructure. He can no longer assume he is the smartest person in any given universe. The wall around infinity has a hole in it. Things from outside the curve could potentially enter. Rick and Morty could potentially leave. Everything has changed because evil Morty succeeded in his plan to escape the infinite crib built around the infinite baby. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Life Outside the Curve and the Space Mansion. The episode opens with a cold open showing the origin of evil Morty. The scene begins in a dimension where Rick and Morty are celebrating a major achievement. Rick has just invented portal technology that allows them to visit infinite universes. The family cheers and celebrates. Morty asks if this means infinite other families can do the same thing. Rick starts to explain that infinite families did not invent the world's first portal gun when suddenly they are all killed by an unknown attacker. The scene shifts to show this Rick was Rick Prime, the same Rick who killed C-137 Rick's wife Diane. Rick Prime laughs and says he just made them free and empowered, calling himself the best father ever. The family lies dead around him. The cold open continues, showing evil Morty's backstory. We see a young Morty going on dangerous adventures with his Rick. The adventures are extremely violent and life-threatening. Morty looks exhausted and traumatized by the constant danger. One night, Morty approaches Rick while Rick is drunk. Rick is being affectionate and tells Morty he is his little buddy. Rick says it is Rick and Morty for 100 years, forever. Morty agrees and says yes. Rick and Morty 100 years forever. While Rick is drunk and vulnerable, Morty puts something in Rick's drink. Rick asks what Morty is doing and screams. A bell chimes. The scene shows an eye patch. Rick comments that they know how they feel about pirates. We see Morty attaching the eye patch device to Rick's head. Rick is screaming and struggling. Morty is typing commands into a computer. The eye patch activates and takes control of Rick's brain. This is the origin of evil Rick from close Rick counters of the Rick kind. Morty created the eye patch technology to control his own Rick and use him as a puppet. The main episode begins with Rick C-137 and Morty Prime on an adventure. Morty complains that this is another adventure where he went up someone's ass. Rick asks if they are having this fight again. He guesses Morty is going to leave or throw a sulking fit. Morty says Rick thinks he knows everything, but Rick is basically just a giant 8-year-old. Rick says he is not doing this anymore. Either Morty is in or he is out. Rick is tired of Morty weaponizing this half-ass threat. If Morty wants out, then he should fucking quit. Morty says Rick is right and apologizes for being such a high-maintenance Morty. He asks if Rick wants a drink. The scene cuts to show this was Morty drugging Rick, just like evil Morty did in the cold open. But this time, it is a flashback showing Rick waking up to realize what happened. Rick finds himself trapped somewhere, with Morty missing. The episode reveals that Rick C-137 has been hunting Rick Prime for a long time. Rick is using a technique where he merges dimensions to consolidate Rick Prime's decoys and flush him out. Rick compares it to fracking the central finite curve. Morty comments that it is good to see Rick outside the sub-basement even if Rick never kills the version of himself that killed his wife. Morty says giving it his best shot looks good on Rick. Rick thanks Morty and says it means a lot that Morty's bar for mental health has gotten lower than Rick's own. Suddenly, a portal opens and evil Morty emerges. He is angry and asks what the fuck Rick is doing. Morty panics and asks if he should grab the net. Rick tells him yes and to hang tight while Morty gets the net. Evil Morty looks around and realizes what is happening. He asks if this is what he thinks it is. Of course it is, because everything is what he thinks it is. Rick is fracking the central finite curve to flush out a version of himself. Evil Morty sarcastically asks if Rick should not be turning himself into a pickle instead. Rick asks what Evil Morty cares about what Rick does to the curve. Rick thought Evil Morty's whole gimmick was fucking off, which is what made Rick a fan. Evil Morty responds that Rick is right. Evil Morty does not live inside the curve anymore, which is why it is insane that Rick is still bugging him. The shockwaves from Rick's dimensional merging have more range than Rick thought, and are reaching outside the central finite curve. Rick heard a compliment in that statement. Evil Morty points out that a monkey humping a shotgun has more range than it thought. He looks at Rick's scan array and criticizes it. Rick tells him not to touch it. Evil Morty asks why he would touch it when he does not want it improved. Rick takes offense at the word improved. Evil Morty explains that Rick is hitting infinite targets. Rick should at least filter for probability stasis. Rick claims he was going to do that already. Morty returns panting and says he cannot find the net. He asks if they should just shoot Evil Morty. Rick responds that Evil Morty is too smart not to keep a force field on. Evil Morty tells Morty to listen to Pop Pop. Rick says he would be an idiot if he did not check anyway, and fires at Evil Morty. The shot bounces off a force field. Evil Morty comments that Rick will not backpedal every time he does this. Evil Morty starts adjusting Rick's equipment. Rick asks if he is changing something. Evil Morty explains he is filtering for probability stasis, just like he said Rick should. An alarm starts ringing. They ask if that is the guy they are looking for. Rick says probably. Morty comments that Rick is acting like this one is different. Rick admits this target is different, but different does not mean it is actually Rick Prime. It could be a trap. Evil Morty explains that Rick is worried it is actually the target, and Rick would owe Evil Morty credit for the kill. Rick calls Evil Morty a narcissist. Evil Morty responds that Rick lives in a literal glass house. Rick asks if Evil Morty thinks he is better than Rick. Evil Morty says Jesus. He hopes so. Rick Prime's voice suddenly speaks. He clears his throat and asks if he can offer his 2 cents. Everyone yells no. A portal opens beneath them and they all fall through. They scream as they fall into Rick Prime's trap. They land in a dark, enclosed space. Rick looks at the bright side and says, "At least Evil Morty got to experience being wrong before he died." Evil Morty admits that is true, and that is what he gets for talking to Rick instead of killing him. Morty asks what this place is. Rick assumes it is a box to contain Ricks that get too close to Rick Prime. Evil Morty asks if Rick is basing that on what Rick would do, since all Ricks are the same. Rick says he is basing it on the ensemble of thematic Ricks huddled opposite their point of view. Several other Ricks are trapped in this space with them. The Ricks make comments about fresh meat. Rick tells them to pick a lane because they cannot do the fresh meat line while cowering in shadow. The Ricks in the trap all arrive the same way by hunting Rick Prime. One Rick asks how Rick C-137 arrived with 2 Mortys. Another Rick comments that attachment is death, and that is what he learned chasing Rick Prime. Rick suggests that instead of explaining how they all ended up in this trap, they should pool some data. He asks who got here first. One Rick brags that he knocked off 3 clones for this door prize. Another Rick sarcastically says, "Oh wow, 3 clones." One Rick screams that Rick Prime killed his wife. All the other Ricks say they know. The Rick keeps screaming about his dead wife. Someone shoots him. The Ricks wonder if this is the torture, just being stuck here. Rick Prime's voice activates an automated message. He says it looks like there are enough Ricks to start the next ride, or just one really heavy Rick. The whole thing is automated, which Rick Prime points out specifically to enhance the humiliation. Rick Prime's recorded message plays. He says if they are seeing this, they are him, except less. But they acted like they were better, so Rick Prime killed their beloved Diane, partly to devastate them, mostly so he only has to record one message. Some of them may have noticed that it is not just their Diane that is gone. She has been erased from every universe across infinity. Evil Morty interrupts and says he would rather hear how Rick Prime did this. Rick Prime explains that Diane was wiped from all existence by the weapon too cool for a name. Rick C. 137 knows this weapon as the Omega device. Rick Prime confirms it is known to inferiors as the Omega device. Rick mutters that he heard the name from an inferior. Rick Prime continues saying it is his weapon, but it is the trapped Rick's fault that he had to use it on Diane. So if they want to see the Rick that ruined their life, they should look around because there are so many of them. But that is why Rick Prime wants to make a deal. One of them is going to get their Diane back. Rick C. 137 yells that Rick Prime is lying. Rick Prime says all they have to do is be the last Rick left. A countdown starts. The Ricks immediately start killing each other in a brutal fight. Rick C. 137 tries to stop them and says Rick Prime cannot bring Diane back. The Ricks are too desperate and keep fighting. One Rick says he is a nice Rick before getting killed. Evil Morty watches and passes on, getting involved in the initial chaos. Morty yells at Evil Morty that he is such a dick and they could have worked together. The Rick, who claimed to be nice, admits he was definitely going to kill Rick and Morty anyway before dying. The countdown continues as more Ricks die. Eventually, only a few Ricks remain, including Rick C. 137, Evil Morty, and Morty. One Rick tells another to take a shot at him. That Rick says he thought they wanted to work together. The other Rick admits it was just until he could kill the first Rick. Evil Morty comments that they call him Evil Morty, as if he is the bad one here. Rick C. 137 tells Evil Morty that the easiest way out of any box is to be the least shaped like a box. They both hate Rick Prime more than each other anyway. Evil Morty asks where Rick got that idea. Rick says Rick Prime is the worst Rick. Evil Morty responds, that big deal, the worst turd is a pizza. The fighting continues. One Rick seems much tougher than the others and is dominating the fight. Someone asks how the worst turd is a pizza. Rick C. 137 asks if everyone is cool with just killing this tough Rick. They all agree. Eventually, the fighting ends with Rick C. 137, Evil Morty, and Morty still alive. Rick Prime's message continues. He congratulates the final Rick, or if it was just one fat Rick, he compliments the impressive cardio. And now the big reveal. Does the winner get Diane back? Not in any real sense, because when Rick Prime builds a weapon, it works. It is called being talented. But Rick Prime does have a Diane that promises to be with the winner until death. But Rick Prime suggests getting to the death part fast because they do not want to be here when this place resets. A hologram of Diane appears. Rick greets her. The hologram Diane tells Rick he sucked at eating pussy. Rick says that was clearly just said to be hurtful, but he will not deny it. He was young. The Diane hologram attacks Rick. Rick says he misses that face even as she is trying to kill him. The other surviving Ricks comment that Rick never told them Rick Prime killed his wife across infinity. They say they want to meet Rick Prime too now. Rick says he does not want to talk about this. The hologram Diane keeps insulting Rick, saying she always thought his dick smelled weird. Rick says he does not want to talk about that either. The Diane hologram glitches and attacks. One Rick asks if Rick is taking the Diane hologram to go. The room starts shaking. Rick says it looks like they survived the box. Another Rick says not to count chickens yet. Someone says they did not trigger the room shaking. They decide to leave before the trap self-cleans. They try to open portals but cannot. Someone asks if it is a sub-other barrier blocking the portal fluid. Evil Morty says it cannot be that because his portal gun would get through it. They examine the situation. Someone realizes they can use the goo from the trap as a vector to escape. They quickly open a portal and escape just as the trap is destroying itself. Rick C. 137 and Morty celebrate that the experience was insane. Rick says he is excited because clearly no one has escaped that trap before. Evil Morty sarcastically comments that Rick really learned his lesson about chasing Rick Prime. Rick tells Evil Morty he can leave now. Evil Morty agrees that is true and he can leave. Rick suddenly has a realization about the weapon. The Omega device that wipes someone out across all dimensions could wipe Rick Prime out across all dimensions. That is why Rick Prime is vulnerable. Evil Morty asks if Rick is exhausted yet. Rick says he cannot help it because he is a rascal. Rick tells Morty he cannot come on this next mission. Rick tells Evil Morty to stay out of his way. Rick is going to kill his nemesis. Rick opens a portal and leaves. Evil Morty comments that Rick is a weird guy. Morty asks Evil Morty if Rick is right about him being afraid of the weapon. Evil Morty asks Morty what happens if Rick actually kills Rick Prime. Has Morty ever thought about that? Maybe Rick will kill himself next. Morty calls Evil Morty an asshole. Evil Morty points out he is not good Morty. Evil Morty tells Morty to come or not, he does not care. Evil Morty opens a portal. Morty says, "Oh shit," and takes a step toward the portal, but it closes before he can go through. Evil Morty opens another portal. He admits he totally thought Morty was coming. Morty says he was coming and took a heroic step toward the portal, but then it closed. Evil Morty tells him to come on, and they go through together. Rick C-137 arrives at Rick Prime's base. He sees Rick Prime rebuilt his original house from the flashbacks. Rick comments that Rick Prime built it again, and that is pretty impressive. Rick admits that Rick Prime is him with free time. Rick says he does not see a place to park the ship. Rick tells the ship's AI to catch its breath and then keep enemies off his back. The ship's AI says if Rick dies, it is taking his stuff. Rick says that is gross. Evil Morty and Morty arrive as well. Rick is surprised they came. Evil Morty asks, "What? No one can do undercuts but Rick." Rick asks why Evil Morty brought Morty. Evil Morty says he is not worried about Morty because Evil Morty is evil. Morty asks Rick if this is Rick Prime's original house. Someone comments that Rick and Rick Prime do not do anything small. They wonder why Rick Prime has not attacked yet. Rick Prime's voice suddenly activates. He says, "All right, here we go." They say there it is, and yep, Rick Prime addresses Rick C-137 directly. He calls him the wife guy and dead wife Rick. Rick Prime says Rick C-137 does not know when to quit. Rick C-137 tells Rick Prime he is going to fucking kill him. Rick Prime asks if Rick brought two Mortys as a cheering section. Evil Morty clarifies that they brought themselves. Rick Prime says honestly he misses when it was just him and Rick C-137, the only two Ricks who actually invented portal travel. Rick Prime asks if anyone else is about to arrive like Rick's car. The ship AI says it can see why Rick hates Rick Prime. Rick Prime comments that the AI sounds like their wife, in a fucked up robot way, but definitely her voice. He calls Rick C-137 a sentimental little fellow. Rick Prime says he would have tried that too. Rick Prime explains he upgraded the Omega device. The new version can fire more than once. So now he can erase Rick's whole family one by one until Rick finally learns his lesson, which he will not, so then Rick Prime will kill Rick too. Rick Prime says he will do that the old-fashioned way. He announces it is family killing time and says to start small but still family. Rick Prime activates the Omega device. A figure appears. It is Slow Mobius, also known as Uncle Slow. He is a relative of Rick's who has time manipulation powers that make everything around him move in slow motion. Slow Mobius asks where he is. He sees two Ricks and asks where his wife is. He was just with his wife. Rick C-137 recognizes him as Uncle Slow. Morty also recognizes him as Slow Mobius. Rick Prime says this death hurts him too. Rick Prime fires the Omega device at Slow Mobius. Because of his powers, Slow Mobius experiences the death in extreme slow motion. He screams as he is erased. Rick C-137 yells no in slow motion as well. Morty comments that this is kind of the worst possible time to use Slow Mobius's powers because it just made the death happen slower. Rick C-137 screams that he will kill Rick Prime. The two Ricks begin fighting. Rick C-137 and Rick Prime engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat. They are evenly matched and both land devastating hits on each other. They use various weapons and gadgets against each other. The fight is extremely violent. Rick Prime manages to get the upper hand at several points. Rick C-137 gets seriously injured but keeps fighting. Meanwhile, Rick Prime calls out to his original grandson, which is Evil Morty. Rick Prime says this is super weird, and obviously they are both trying to kill each other. Evil Morty responds, "Oh geez," and says nice to meet him, he guesses. Rick Prime asks if they should just get this over with. Evil Morty attacks Rick Prime. Rick Prime says, "Cool grandson." Evil Morty responds, "Shitty grandpa." Morty wakes up confused. He asks why he is wearing an eye patch. He also notices he and Evil Morty switched shirts. Evil Morty thanks Morty for the assist. Morty realizes they did it. Evil Morty got Rick Prime. Morty calls for Rick. Rick is badly injured from the fight. Evil Morty tells the two of them to stay here. He approaches Rick Prime, who is also badly injured. Rick Prime says he thinks he is getting the picture. Evil Morty starts frying Rick Prime's backups to prevent him from respawning. Rick Prime calls that smart and realizes Evil Morty is an evil Morty, a clever one. Rick Prime asks if Evil Morty wants a job. They could be like Batman and Robin. Evil Morty says he does not need a Robin. Rick Prime starts to panic and asks what Evil Morty is doing. Rick Prime warns that Evil Morty does not want those schematics because they are for grown-ups. Evil Morty ignores this and downloads the Omega device plans. Rick Prime realizes what is happening. Rick C-137 wakes up injured and sees what Evil Morty is doing. Evil Morty has successfully copied the Omega device schematics. He hands control over to Rick C-137 and tells him to knock himself out. Rick Prime tries one last appeal to Rick C-137. He warns Rick that Evil Morty has the weapon plans. He tells Rick to nip this in the bud because Evil Morty is 14. What is going to happen the next time Evil Morty gets mad at Grandpa? Rick C-137 ignores the warning and begins brutally beating Rick Prime to death. Rick Prime tries to talk during the beating. He tells Rick that Rick Prime made Rick C-137. He showed Rick C-137 Infinity. He asks what Rick did with it. Rick just hangs out with Rick Prime's grandson and raises echoes of Rick Prime's daughter. Rick Prime asks what Rick's life is without him. Rick C-137 responds that they should find out. Rick Prime is beaten bloody but keeps talking. He tells Rick to admit it. Rick C-137 would have been Rick Prime. Rick Prime just walked into Rick's garage before Rick walked into his. But eventually, Rick C-137 did walk into another Rick's garage. Rick lived in Rick Prime's house. Rick Prime laughs through the pain. Rick C-137 drags Rick Prime's broken body through the house. Rick Prime asks what Rick is doing. Rick activates machinery. Pretty lights and visual effects happen. Rick Prime comments that it is a pretty cool visual and Rick is missing it. Rick C-137 does not respond. The machine activates fully. Rick Prime's body is destroyed in an extremely graphic way. His blood and remains are splattered everywhere. Evil Morty and Morty arrive to see the aftermath. Morty asks Rick if it is over. He asks if Rick Prime is dead. Evil Morty comments that there is not exactly an alive amount of blood left. Evil Morty asks Rick how it feels. Does he feel better? No. Does he feel exactly the same? Yeah, it always does. Evil Morty hopes Rick is happy with his choice. Rick tells Evil Morty to fuck off. Evil Morty says he is going to fuck off. But Rick should not force Evil Morty to improve on the Omega device design. Evil Morty can end the Rick experiment anytime he wants. Morty asks Evil Morty why he would threaten that instead of just doing it. Evil Morty explains that using a weapon like this does not get you left alone. He does not want a bunch of vengeful summers coming after him. But Rick C-137 is a little different though. Maybe Evil Morty can use that someday. Evil Morty tells Rick seriously to fuck off and not come after him. It will not go well. Morty asks Rick if he is okay. Rick says, yeah. Morty starts babbling about how scared he was when the drones uncloaked earlier. The episode ends with a montage. Sad music plays over scenes showing the aftermath. Slow Mobius's daughter and wife are shown. The daughter looks at a picture and asks her mother who the man in the picture is. Her mother struggles to explain. She says that is the daughter's father. She asks if the daughter remembers her father. The daughter says, oh yeah, as if she just barely remembers. Because Slow Mobius was erased across all universes, reality has adjusted so that he barely existed in anyone's memory. The family still exists, but with only faint traces of Slow Mobius remaining. The episode ends on this tragic note, showing the true horror of the Omega device. It does not just kill someone, it erases them from existence so completely that even their loved ones can barely remember they existed. Rick C-137 got his revenge by killing Rick Prime, but the cost was enormous and the victory feels hollow. Evil Morty successfully stole the Omega device plans and now possesses the power to erase any Rick or Morty from all existence if they come after him. He warns Rick not to pursue him and leaves through a portal back to his life outside the central finite curve. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Evil Morty's first demonstration of multiverse-scale strategic thinking. Evil Morty's first demonstration of multiverse-scale strategic thinking demonstrates strategic thinking and planning ability far beyond what anyone expects from a Morty. The episode reveals a massive conspiracy involving 27 murdered Ricks, dozens of kidnapped Mortys, and an elaborate frame job designed to redirect the Council of Ricks' attention away from the real perpetrator. The plan operates on multiple levels simultaneously and succeeds in every objective despite the involvement of the smartest beings in the multiverse. The episode opens in a dimension that is not C-137. A Smith family sits around the breakfast table eating. Beth mentions that tomorrow marks the 1-year anniversary of Rick being back in their lives. She plans to make flying saucer-shaped pancakes. Rick tells her regular pancakes are fine. The scene appears normal until a portal suddenly opens on the wall. 2 figures emerge, carrying weapons. One is a Rick with a gun. The other is a Morty with a tranquilizer. The Rick shoots the family's Rick in the head, killing him instantly. The Morty shoots the family's Morty with a tranquilizer dart. The Morty passes out. The 2 attackers drag the unconscious Morty across the breakfast table and through the portal. The family screams in horror but cannot stop what happens. This opening establishes that Ricks are being murdered and Mortys are being kidnapped across multiple dimensions. The attackers work with precision and efficiency. The scene shifts to Dimension C-137, where Beth celebrates the same anniversary with her father, Rick. The mood is cheerful until 3 armed Ricks burst through a portal. They announce that Rick Sanchez of Earth Dimension C-137 is under arrest for crimes against alternate Ricks by the authority of the Transdimensional Council of Ricks. Jerry tries to object, but gets frozen by a weapon. The lead Rick orders his team to bring Rick's Morty along as well. Rick C-137 protests, but the lead Rick says he lost the right to have a say when he refused to join the council. Rick and Morty are taken through a portal to the Citadel of Ricks. At the Citadel, Rick explains to Morty what this place is. The Citadel serves as secret headquarters for the Council of Ricks. Rick has many enemies in the universe who consider his genius a threat. Many versions of Rick across different timelines face the same problem, so a few thousand versions of Rick had the idea of banding together for mutual protection. The Citadel operates like a marketplace, where Ricks sell products related to Mortys. Rick and Morty are brought before the Council of Ricks. The Council displays holograms showing 27 Ricks who have been brutally murdered in their own timelines. They call it an unprecedented Rickocidal epidemic. The Council asks what Rick C-137 has to say about this. Rick C-137 asks if they really think he did this. He wants to know why he is the first Rick they pull in every time something goes wrong. The council member explains that Rick C-137 has a history of non-cooperation with the council. Rick C-137 points out that other non-cooperative Ricks exist. The council reveals that the scientist formerly known as Rick is also dead. The crowd gasps. The council explains that Rick C-137 fits the profile perfectly. Of all the Ricks in the central finite curve, he is the malcontent and the rogue. Rick C-137 argues that he is the Rick, and so were all the other Ricks before they formed this alliance. They wanted to be safe from the government, so they became a government. The council decides to scan Rick's portal gun for evidence. The scan reveals that Rick C-137's portal gun has been to the exact timelines and locations where the murders occurred. The entries flash red on the display, showing perfect matches. Rick C-137 insists he is obviously being set up. The council sentences Rick C-137 to the machine of unspeakable doom. This machine swaps conscious and unconscious minds, rendering fantasies pointless while everything you know becomes impossible to grasp. Also, every 10 seconds it stabs your balls. Rick decides he has heard enough. He attacks the guards, steals a gun, and shoots himself and Morty free from their restraints. Rick and Morty run down the corridor while armed Ricks chase them. Rick shoots portals into the walls as they run. The pursuing Ricks get set on fire, attacked by insects, dragged into portals by tentacles, or hit by falling pumpkins. Rick and Morty escape through multiple bizarre dimensions, including Butt World, a pizza dimension, Greasy Grandma World, a phone dimension, and a dimension full of creatures saying doop-a-doo repeatedly. Rick shoots multiple portals into one wall and enters the last one. The pursuing Ricks do not know which portal to follow and give up the chase. Rick and Morty end up in the chair dimension at a restaurant. Morty reflects on seeing all those Ricks and Mortys at the Citadel. He initially thought it devalued their bond, but then realized their relationship must be special to span over all those different timelines. Rick responds that it has to be that way because Morty is camouflage. Morty asks what Rick means. Rick explains that Ricks have a very distinct and traceable brainwave due to their genius. The best way to hide from an enemy's radar is to stand near someone with complementary brainwaves that make the Rick's brainwaves invisible. When a Rick is with a Morty, the genius waves get cancelled out by the Morty waves. Rick suddenly realizes his portal gun was hacked remotely, obviously by the real killer to frame him, but he was able to trace the signal back to its source. Rick and Morty fly through space following the signal. They approach a large dome structure. As they get closer, they see the dome is completely covered in naked Mortys strapped to the surface. Contraptions constantly stab the Mortys' sides, causing them to scream in agony. Morty asks why someone would do something so horrible. Rick explains that one Morty is enough to hide from the bureaucrats, but if you get a whole matrix of Mortys and put them in agonizing pain, that creates a pattern that can hide even from other Ricks. Rick admits he fiddled with a concept like this once on paper only. He would never actually do this because it is barbaric overkill. You could accomplish the same result with like 5 Mortys and a jumper cable, which he also would not do. He is just saying the craftsmanship here is bad. Inside the dome, Rick and Morty explore dark corridors. Morty angrily tells Rick that Rick does not care about Morty at all. Morty is no different than Rick's jacket or portal gun. Morty is just a tool, just an object. Rick tells Morty to be quiet because they need to get the drop on whoever is running this place. Morty says he is more than a human shield. Rick agrees that Morty is more than that. Morty is a perfect, impenetrable suit of human armor because he is as dumb as Rick is smart. Lobster-like aliens emerge and surround them. Rick starts fighting, but more aliens appear. Evil Rick and Evil Morty emerge from a corridor. Evil Rick slow claps sarcastically. Rick C. 137 comments that the slow clap is kind of played out. Evil Rick says it is not played out in this dimension. In fact, he invented it, and nobody else has done it here before. The lobster aliens capture Rick and Morty. Evil Rick orders the aliens to take Rick C. 137's Morty away. Evil Morty steps forward and tells Morty C. 137 to come with him. Morty says gladly and adds that Ricks are something else. The two Mortys walk down a corridor together. Morty C. 137 asks if there is any way they can shut down the grid and rescue all those Mortys outside. Evil Morty responds that it would be pointless. Mortys have no chance of defeating a Rick. He opens a door and tells Morty to go inside. The room is filled with scared, shivering Mortys who have been captured. Morty tries to leave, but Evil Morty closes the door and locks it from outside. Rick C. 137 wakes up tied to an examination table in Evil Rick's laboratory. Many of the tortured Mortys from outside are visible in the background, still being used for the psychic dampening grid. Evil Rick asks if the setup is not beautiful. Rick makes a sarcastic joke. A lobster alien laughs. Rick says that alien got his joke. Evil Rick tells Rick to be quiet because he is missing Evil Rick's symphony. Evil Rick presses a button, allowing the sounds of Morty's screaming in pain to come through. He conducts the sounds like music. Rick makes another joke. The lobster alien laughs again. Evil Rick explains, the alien is not laughing at Rick's jokes. That is just a random noise it makes every 10 seconds. The alien proves this by laughing on schedule. Evil Rick tells Rick that he is not as clever as he thinks. Evil Rick wanted Rick to find him. They are not so different. Evil Rick activates a display showing all the Ricks from different timelines arranged on a spectrum from most evil to least evil. He shows where Evil Rick ranks and where Rick C. 137 ranks. Rick C. 137 gets it. Evil Rick wants to team up to take down the Council of Ricks. That is where Rick would be going with this. Evil Rick says no. He thinks he is doing pretty good on his own. He is simply going to download the contents of Rick C. 137's brain and then kill him. This reveals the true purpose of the entire operation. Evil Rick needed to capture Rick C. 137 specifically to scan his brain for information. In the Morty prison, religious Mortys worship something called the One True Morty. They offer Morty C. 137 a pamphlet titled The Good Morty. Morty C. 137 rejects their fatalism. He tells all the Mortys to listen up. His name is Morty Smith from Earth Dimension C. 137. He knows they are scared because he is scared too, but that is no reason to accept their fate. They are Mortys, and they are not defined by their relationships to Rick. Their destiny is their own. One Morty says this sounds like something the One True Morty might say. He is sick of being a human shield and wants to be a gardener. Another Morty wants to write crazy, intense action novels. A Morty holding a hammer says he is more than just a hammer. The religious Morty declares that Morty C-137 is the one true Morty. All the Mortys cheer. A lobster alien opens the door and tells them to keep it down. All the Mortys rush the door together and break free. They charge down the corridor as a unified mob. In Evil Rick's laboratory, Evil Rick reviews Rick C-137's memories on a screen. The memories being displayed show various moments featuring Morty. Rick C-137 tears up watching them. Evil Rick asks if Rick is crying over a Morty. Rick says no, he is just allergic to dipshits. Evil Rick calls this pathetic. Both of them know that if there is any truth in the universe, it is that Ricks do not care about Mortys. The Mortys burst through the door and rush at Evil Rick. They kill the lobster aliens and surround Evil Rick, tearing into him as a group. Evil Rick tells them to do their worst and kill him. He repeats, "Do it," as the Mortys overwhelm him. Evil Rick dies under the assault. Morty C-137 appears and approaches Rick C-137, who is still strapped to the examination table. Rick tells Morty to get him out of this. Morty says, "Rick is lucky. Morty is not a Rick." Morty unbuckles Rick from the table. Rick says, "Point taken, but this is no time for character arcs." Rick presses a button that disengages the Morty torture grid outside. The Mortys are released and pour down off the dome. Ricks from the Citadel arrive at Evil Rick's laboratory and stop the Mortys from continuing to attack Evil Rick's corpse. The Council apologizes to Rick C-137 for the false accusation. They offer him a voucher for a free replacement Morty, in case his current Morty experiences problems. Rick takes the voucher and leaves with Morty. Outside the Citadel, Rick and Morty walk away. Morty points out that he did a great job back there for a human cloaking device. He saved Rick's ass. Rick tells Morty not to break an arm, jerking himself off. Morty wants Rick to show some humanity and connect with him. Rick says maybe he does not connect because he is the Rickest Rick there is. The Rickest Rick would have the Mortiest Morty. Morty asks if that would go without saying. Rick confirms it would. Did Morty hear him say it? The scene shifts to Evil Rick's laboratory, where two Ricks from the Council inspect the body. One Rick comments on what a mess it is and says Evil Rick got what he deserved. The other Rick notices something and asks for a laser defibrillator. They examine Evil Rick's head and discover wires. They remove the top of Evil Rick's skull to reveal electronics woven into his brain. They pull out a chip. One Rick recognizes this technology. Evil Rick was being controlled remotely, puppeteered by somebody else. This is the receiver. The other Rick asks where the transmitter is. The scene cuts to the Citadel, where Mortys are being loaded into spaceships to be delivered to their respective dimensions. Evil Morty follows them in line. He removes his eye patch, revealing the transmitter hidden underneath. He crushes it underfoot and hides the wires in his pocket. He then follows the rest of the Mortys onto the ships. The song "For the Damaged Coda" plays during this reveal. Documents are shown floating in space. The papers contain photographs of a Morty with an eye patch. Another photo shows this Morty standing next to the puppet-controlled Rick before the pictures float away into the void. Evil Morty escapes completely undetected by pretending to be just another victim. The real killer has successfully framed Rick C-137, murdered 27 Ricks, kidnapped dozens of Mortys, built a massive torture facility, scanned Rick C-137's brain, and escaped without anyone knowing his identity. The entire plan operated across multiple dimensions simultaneously and succeeded in every objective. The strategic thinking demonstrated in this episode operates on a level far beyond what anyone expects from a Morty. First, Evil Morty identified a specific vulnerability in how the Council of Ricks investigates crimes. They have a bias towards suspecting Rick C-137 because of his history of non-cooperation. Evil Morty exploited this bias by hacking Rick C-137's portal gun and programming it to visit the murder locations. This planted false evidence that would inevitably lead the Council directly to their preferred suspect. The frame job was simple but effective because it worked with the Council's existing prejudices rather than against them. Second, Evil Morty understood the technical systems underlying Rick technology well enough to both hack portal guns and build a massive psychic dampening grid. The Morty Torture Dome represents advanced understanding of neuroscience, engineering, and dimensional physics. Evil Rick built this facility, but Evil Rick was just a puppet. Evil Morty designed and controlled everything through the eye patch transmitter, a 14-year-old built technology sophisticated enough to hide from an entire civilization of the smartest beings in the multiverse. The craftsmanship might have been inefficient, as Rick C-137 noted, but it functioned perfectly for its intended purpose. Third, Evil Morty orchestrated a complex multi-stage operation across at least 28 dimensions simultaneously. Each Rick had to be identified, tracked, isolated, and killed. Each Morty had to be kidnapped at the precise moment to prevent other Ricks from responding. The murders were coordinated to create a pattern that would panic the Council and force them to investigate. The entire operation was timed to occur when Rick C-137 was available to be framed. Every element had to work together or the plan would fail. This requires project management skills and attention to detail far beyond what anyone expects from any Morty anywhere. Fourth, Evil Morty understood the psychology of both Ricks and Mortys well enough to manipulate entire groups. He knew the Council would immediately suspect Rick C-137 based on past behavior. He knew Rick C-137 would investigate independently rather than accept arrest. He knew Rick C-137 would trace the signal because that is what any Rick would do when framed. He knew the captured Ricks would immediately turn on each other when offered hope of getting Diane back. He knew the imprisoned Mortys could be rallied to fight back with the right speech. He knew Morty C-137 specifically would give that speech because that is who Morty C-137 is. Every psychological prediction proved accurate. Fifth, Evil Morty maintained operational security throughout the entire plan. Evil Rick never spoke about who was really in control. The lobster alien served as muscle but showed no awareness of the larger plan. The tortured Mortys on the dome could not communicate with anyone. The imprisoned Mortys inside believed they were waiting to be used as replacements for dead Mortys, rather than understanding their true purpose in the operation. Even when Morty C-137 spoke with Evil Morty directly, Evil Morty maintained his cover by acting like just another scared victim. Nobody suspected the truth until after Evil Morty had already escaped. Sixth, Evil Morty planned his escape before the operation even began. He knew the plan would eventually fail once Rick C-137 was freed. He knew the imprisoned Mortys would fight back once someone inspired them. He knew Evil Rick's body would be examined after death. He designed every stage of the plan to end with him blending into a crowd of legitimate Morty victims. When the Council Ricks arrived to clean up the situation, they found exactly what they expected to find: rescued Mortys being returned to their homes. Evil Morty walked onto a transport ship with all the other Mortys and left. Nobody checked which Mortys were real victims and which one was the perpetrator. The scale of deception involved in this operation cannot be overstated. Evil Morty fooled the smartest beings in the multiverse. The Council of Ricks failed to identify the real killer. Rick C-137 never suspected a Morty could be responsible. The other captured Ricks never questioned Evil Rick's motivations. The imprisoned Mortys never wondered why one specific Morty was allowed to move freely. Even the audience watching the episode did not suspect the truth until the final reveal. Evil Morty achieved complete surprise despite operating in plain sight throughout the entire episode. The resources required for this operation reveal advanced capabilities. Evil Morty had access to portal technology before the episode began. He could travel between dimensions freely. He had the technical knowledge to build the transmitter and receiver that controlled Evil Rick. He had the scientific understanding to design a Morty torture grid that could hide him from other Ricks. He had the materials and labor to construct a massive domed facility. He had the weapons and equipment needed to murder 27 Ricks. He had the ability to hack portal guns remotely. All of these capabilities had to be developed before the operation began. Evil Morty spent significant time preparing before ever putting his plan into action. The choice of Rick C-137 as the patsy was not random. Evil Morty specifically targeted the Rick most likely to survive the Council's investigation and escape. A less capable Rick would have been convicted and executed, ending the investigation before Evil Morty could scan his brain. Rick C-137's reputation for independence and his history with the Council made him the perfect suspect. He would obviously be arrested. He would obviously escape. He would obviously investigate. He would obviously trace the signal. He would obviously walk directly into the trap. Evil Morty predicted Rick C-137's every move and used those predictions to guide Rick exactly where Evil Morty wanted him to go. The decision to scan Rick C-137's brain reveals Evil Morty's ultimate objective. He did not murder 27 Ricks for revenge. He did not build the torture dome for protection. He did not frame Rick C-137 for fun. Every element of the plan existed to accomplish one specific goal: obtaining information from Rick C-137's brain. Evil Rick says he is going to download the contents of Rick's brain and then kill him. This was always the plan. Everything else was infrastructure to make that moment possible. What information Evil Morty wanted and what he planned to do with it would not be revealed for years, but the operation succeeded in obtaining it. The episode ends with Evil Morty successfully escaping with Rick C-137's brain data, the Citadel completely unaware that a Morty orchestrated everything, and Rick C-137 having no idea who really framed him. The operation represents a perfect crime executed across multiple dimensions. 27 Ricks died. Dozens of Mortys were tortured. Rick C-137 was framed, arrested, and nearly executed, and the person responsible walked away without anyone knowing he existed. This is not the behavior of a normal Morty. This is the first demonstration that Morty-79 possesses strategic thinking and planning ability far beyond any Morty and potentially beyond most Ricks. The multiverse would not understand the true significance of this operation until much later, when Evil Morty returned to execute even more ambitious plans. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Next up, the moment Evil Morty exposed the Citadel as a rigged system built on Morty's suffering. Evil Morty's return to the Citadel in the Ricklantis mix-up demonstrates strategic thinking that goes far beyond his first appearance. In close Rick counters of the Rick kind, he executed a complex operation to scan Rick C-137's brain, but that operation focused on technical objectives like hacking portal guns and building torture grids. The Ricklantis mix-up reveals something more sophisticated. Evil Morty does not just understand how to manipulate technology, he understands how to manipulate entire social systems. He recognizes that the Citadel operates as a rigged game designed to exploit Mortys, and he uses that understanding to seize absolute power. The episode opens with Rick and Morty K-22 arriving at Rick C-137's garage, asking for donations to the Citadel of Rick's redevelopment fund. Rick C-137 refuses because he murdered everyone in charge and left the place to rot. Morty wonders what day-to-day lives are like for Ricks and Mortys still living on the Citadel. Rick says anyone continuing to explore the Citadel is either stupid or one of the unfortunate millions held hostage by terrible ideas. The episode then shifts entirely to the Citadel, showing multiple storylines that all illustrate the same basic truth. The Citadel is a deeply broken society built on exploitation and inequality. The Citadel is still undergoing reconstruction after Rick C-137 destroyed the Council of Ricks. Buildings remain damaged. Construction crews work to rebuild. But beneath the physical reconstruction, the social systems operate exactly as before. Campaign manager Morty tries to hail a cab, but it passes him by to pick up a Rick in a business suit instead. This small moment establishes that Ricks receive preferential treatment in every aspect of Citadel life. At the police academy, trainee Ricks practice shooting at targets. At Morty Academy, Mortys grab books from lockers decorated with pictures of Jessica, while teacher Rick watches over them. On the morning commute train, Ricks pull out flasks and drink simultaneously. Rick J-22 looks out the window and sees a wealthy Rick in a flying car enjoying sardines and champagne. He sighs at the inequality. The Citadel Morning News broadcasts updates about the upcoming presidential election. Just one day remains before the newly Democratic Citadel elects its first president. The race appears open among the Rick candidates, including retired General Rick, Private Sector Rick, Juggling Rick, Rick Guilt Rick, and Reverse Rick Outrage. But the news anchors mock one particular candidate. Candidate Morty leads the Morty Party. The anchors show footage of him visiting hospitalized Mortys for photo opportunities. They call him adorable and a little jackass. They show him giving a speech and pretend to play audio where he whines about losing the election. Both news anchors laugh at their own joke. This establishes that the Citadel power structure treats a Morty candidate as a joke rather than a serious threat. At Morty campaign headquarters, campaign manager Morty watches the news coverage. He tells candidate Morty they had a good run, but it is time to pull out of the race. Candidate Morty responds that he feels pretty confident about tonight's debate. Campaign manager Morty says, candidate Morty should not feel confident. He should be terrified. Candidate Morty suggests that campaign manager Morty should find a little faith. Campaign manager Morty points out that candidate Morty does not pay him to have faith. Also, they are the same age. This exchange establishes that even candidate Morty's own campaign manager expects him to lose. Nobody takes the Morty party seriously. A Morty becoming president seems impossible within the established system. Throughout the episode, various storylines demonstrate how the Citadel exploits Mortys and lower-class Ricks. At Morty Academy, teacher Rick forces students to repeat phrases like, "Good idea," "Rick," and "This is a great adventure," and "I love being your new Morty." One student named Slick substitutes farty for Morty, and the class laughs. Teacher Rick responds by humiliating Slick, reminding him that his first Rick was decapitated on Zorpathian 9, or maybe it was his third Rick. Teacher Rick asks how many Ricks Slick has had. Slick admits he has had 5 Ricks. Teacher Rick says Slick is top of the class in something, implying Slick is the best at getting his Ricks killed. The other Mortys laugh at Slick's expense. This scene establishes that Morty Academy exists to condition Mortys into accepting their role as replaceable sidekicks. Mortys who lose their Ricks simply get assigned new ones. The system treats Morty lives as disposable. At the Simple Rick's wafer cookie factory, assembly line worker Rick J22 performs repetitive labor stamping logos onto cookies. The supervisor Rick announces he received a promotion to regional manager. This makes the supervisor position available. Rick J22 looks hopeful that he might get promoted, but supervisor Rick announces the new supervisor will be K83, also known as Cool Rick. Cool Rick walks up and flips off all the workers. He brags that he knows he is new to the Citadel, and some might not think he has put in his time, but what can he say except that he is Cool Rick? Rick J22's face falls. He worked at this factory for years, but gets passed over for someone new who has connections. This demonstrates that even among Ricks, the system operates on favoritism rather than merit. Lower-class Ricks work for a fraction of their boss's salary, despite being identical with the same IQ. In Mortytown, Cop Rick partners with Cop Morty to investigate a robbery. Cop Morty drives recklessly and nearly hits Mortys with the police cruiser. When a Morty jumps on the hood during a Morty Pride parade, Cop Morty calls him a rickless fucking animal and electrocutes him with the car. Cop Rick says, "That seems harsh." Cop Morty tells him to report it because nobody gives a fuck. Cop Rick expresses sadness, hearing a Morty cop call Mortys animals. Cop Morty responds that it makes him sad seeing another Rick cop buy into sensitivity training. Cop Rick is glad to know there are more cops like him. Cop Morty reveals there was one other cop like Cop Rick. That is why Cop Rick's partner seat was empty. The implication is clear. The previous idealistic cop is dead. The system kills cops who try to reform it from within. Cop Morty and Cop Rick investigate the robbery at Morty Mart. The store employee describes 4 normal Mortys in yellow shirts. A mutant Morty mopping the floor gets annoyed at the word normal, and the employee tells him to put it in his blog. This casual cruelty toward mutant Mortys shows how even among Mortys, a hierarchy exists. Cop Morty approaches 2 Mortys spray painting in an alley. He tries to connect with them using Morty speech patterns, but when one of them calls Cop Morty a sidekick, Cop Morty snaps. He pins the Morty to the wall and shoves a gun in his mouth. He screams, asking if the Morty wants to see how he paints a wall. Cop Rick watches uncertain what to do. The other Morty reveals the robbers were the Mortytown Locos. Cop Morty releases his victim and both Mortys flee. This scene demonstrates how Cop Morty internalizes the system's violence. He becomes the thing he probably hated, a Morty enforcing Rick's rules through brutality. The presidential debate takes place that evening. Retired General Rick is asked how he would address the Citadel's problems. He responds with 2 words, more lasers. The moderator says he can take more time. Retired General Rick remains silent. Juggling Rick is asked how he would solve the financial crisis. He gives a performance where he juggles while talking about education spending and defense spending. The audience cheers. Behind the scenes, campaign manager Morty watches and says the race is over. The moderator turns to candidate Morty for the final question. He points out that displaced Mortys are soaring while Rick's satisfaction is plummeting. The divide between the two groups has never been wider. He smirks and tells candidate Morty to solve that one real quick. The audience laughs, but candidate Morty remains calm. Candidate Morty begins his response by saying he does not see a divide between Ricks and Mortys. The Rick candidates fart and make jokes. Candidate Morty asks if they are finished. He continues by saying the division he sees is between the Ricks and Mortys that like the Citadel divided and the rest of them. He sees this division everywhere. As candidate Morty speaks, the episode cuts to show various scenes illustrating his points. Candidate Morty says he sees it in the schools where they teach Mortys. They are all the same because the system is threatened by what makes them unique. The scene shows Slick, Glasses Morty, Lizard Morty, and Fat Morty sneaking out of school through a window. Candidate Morty says he sees it in the streets where they give guns to Mortys, so they are too busy fighting each other to fight real injustice. The scene shows Cop Morty readying his weapon as they approach the Mortytown locos. Candidate Morty says he sees it in the factories where Ricks work for a fraction of their boss's salary, even though they are identical and have the same IQ. The scene shows Rick J22 at the factory. He watches candidate Morty's speech on a screen. He becomes enraged. He breaks off a piece of machinery and enters Supervisor Rick's office. He shoots Supervisor Rick to death. Other Ricks witness this through the office window. Rick J22 says holy shit and runs to the flavor core chamber. Candidate Morty continues saying, the Citadel's problem is not homeless Mortys or outraged Ricks. The Citadel's problem is the Ricks and Mortys feeding on the Citadel's debt. Rick J22 locks down the flavor core and activates a force field. He encounters Simple Rick slumped in his chair. Candidate Morty delivers his closing line. He has a message for those feeding on the debt from the Ricks and Mortys keeping the Citadel alive. A message from the Ricks and Mortys that believe in this Citadel. To those who do not, you are outnumbered. The audience bursts into applause. This speech represents the turning point of the election. Candidate Morty does not promise specific policies. He does not offer detailed solutions. Instead, he does something far more powerful. He names the system. He identifies the real problem. The Citadel operates on division and exploitation. The powerful maintain control by keeping Ricks and Mortys fighting each other rather than fighting the system. Schools condition Mortys into compliance. Police brutalize Mortytown. Factories exploit workers. And a small group at the top profits from all of it. Candidate Morty's genius lies in recognizing that you do not need to offer solutions when you can simply tell people the truth they already know but cannot say out loud. Every Rick and Morty watching this debate lives with these problems daily. Candidate Morty just gave them permission to acknowledge reality. Campaign manager Morty watches the speech in shock. He cannot believe what just happened. Candidate Morty walks backstage. Campaign manager Morty says he does not believe it. Candidate Morty puts a hand on his shoulder and says that is why campaign manager Morty is fired. Candidate Morty walks away, leaving his campaign manager stunned. This moment reveals candidate Morty's true nature. He never needed campaign manager Morty's faith or support. He used campaign manager Morty to appear legitimate while building his real operation behind the scenes. The second campaign manager Morty stops being useful, candidate Morty discards him. This is not the behavior of an idealistic reformer. This is calculated manipulation. Later that evening, campaign manager Morty sits alone at a bar drinking while watching candidate Morty's press conference on television. A reporter asks about candidate Morty's original reality and where his Rick is. Candidate Morty responds that they moved around so much it is hard to remember. He sees every Rick as his Rick. Campaign manager Morty asks for another drink with less water. Bartender Morty tells him to cheer up because a Morty is going to be president. Campaign manager Morty says he guesses he should have had more faith. Investigator Rick sits nearby and speaks. He tells campaign manager Morty that it is not faith he needs, but fear. Investigator Rick pulls out a dossier from his trench coat and slides it over. Campaign manager Morty asks what this is. Investigator Rick says it is secrets and tells campaign manager Morty to look at how he is dressed. Investigator Rick leaves. Campaign manager Morty opens the dossier and examines the documents inside. His expression changes from confusion to shock to horror. On the television, a reporter asks candidate Morty if he fears for his safety by taking on the system like this. Campaign manager Morty stares at the documents. Candidate Morty responds that he would rather live in hope than fear. If he had to fear anything, he would fear other people being afraid of fear itself. Campaign manager Morty looks up at the television with a disturbed expression. The documents contain evidence about who Candidate Morty really is. Investigator Rick compiled proof that Candidate Morty is actually evil Morty from close Rick counters of the Rick kind. But by the time campaign manager Morty receives this information, it is too late to stop the election. The next day, Candidate Morty greets crowds outside the Hard Rick Cafe. He shakes hands and makes small talk with supporters. A plumber Rick tells Candidate Morty that he is a plumber. He emphasizes he is a Rick and he is a plumber. Candidate Morty asks if that sounds like Rick work. The plumber did not come to the Citadel to be a plumber, did he? Plumber Rick laughs joyfully and agrees he sure did not. A Rick carrying a baby. Rick approaches and says he cloned himself so Candidate Morty can kiss him as a baby. Candidate Morty says this is just like a Morty baby. He kisses the baby, and every Rick cheers. Candidate Morty then sees campaign manager Morty behind the barrier looking very displeased. They shake hands. Candidate Morty asks if campaign manager Morty got a new job. Campaign manager Morty confirms he did. Assassinating Candidate Morty. Campaign manager Morty pulls out a laser pistol and shoots Candidate Morty in the chest. A bodyguard Rick tasers campaign manager Morty, who screams horribly. The other bodyguard tends to Candidate Morty, who bleeds profusely on the floor. Candidate Morty says he is okay repeatedly before falling unconscious. The assassination attempt fails. Candidate Morty survives, and his survival generates enormous sympathy. The news reports that the election results in a blowout victory for Candidate Morty. He becomes President Morty, the first Morty ever to hold this position. Campaign manager Morty is badly beaten by security forces and thrown into an airlock chamber. He tries to explain that Candidate Morty had to be stopped. The bodyguard Rick asks if Candidate Morty is alive. Campaign manager Morty realizes Candidate Morty won the election. The airlock door closes. Campaign manager Morty pulls out the documents from the dossier and tries to show the bodyguards through the sealed door. They cannot hear him. One bodyguard, Rick, presses a button. Campaign manager Morty is instantly sucked out into space along with all the evidence. He dies in the vacuum. The only person who could have exposed President Morty's true identity is now dead, and the evidence floats away into the void. Throughout the episode, various subplots demonstrate the systemic problems President Morty identified in his speech. Rick J22 takes Simple Rick hostage in the Flavor Core chamber. Negotiator Rick tries to talk him down. Rick J22 demands an untraceable portal gun with enough fluid to leave the Citadel. The media reports that Rick J22 says the Citadel is a lie built on lies. Rick J22 yells at the police that they told Ricks they were special but stripped them of anything that made them unique. When Negotiator Rick delivers a portal gun, Rick J22 tests it and discovers the portal leads to the Blender dimension where Simple Rick is instantly killed. Rick J22 realizes the Citadel never intended to let him escape. The owner of the wafer factory, Rick D. Sanchez III, intervenes. He tells the SWAT team that Rick J22 is more Rick than any of them. The Citadel was founded by Ricks for Ricks to be free. Rick D. Sanchez III walks Rick J22 out through the factory to freedom. Workers cheer, but just as Rick J22 reaches the fancy car waiting for him, Rick D. Sanchez III shoots him in the head. Rick J22 becomes the new Simple Rick, hooked into the machine to have his brief moment of hope extracted forever as flavoring for cookies. The system does not reward resistance, it commodifies it. The four Mortys from school search for the wishing portal, a mythical place where wishes supposedly come true. Fat Morty wishes for 1,000,000 sandwiches and throws in his panini maker. Lizard Morty wishes for something cooler than his surfer necklace. Glasses Morty wishes incest porn had more mainstream appeal for a friend. Slick reveals he has a trauma implant. He is part of an experimental line of Mortys, designed to make everyone sad and bored. He wishes anything about this life would change. He throws himself into the portal and plummets to his death. The other Mortys scream in horror. Then a PA announcement says garbage dumps stand back. Large pipes dump garbage into the portal. The wishing portal is not magical. It is just where the Citadel dumps trash. But later, the three surviving Mortys return to school to find Teacher Rick has been fired and the curriculum is changing. Slick's wish came true. His sacrifice actually changed something. This suggests that real change requires real sacrifice rather than empty gestures. Cop Morty and Cop Rick raid the Mortytown Locos hideout. They find the gang with their Rick, who makes bootleg portal fluid. The Rick tries to escape, but his faulty portal disintegrates him. Cop Rick finds a crying Morty in a bedroom. He approaches to help. The Morty stabs him. Cop Rick shoots the Morty. Cop Morty helps Cop Rick to his feet and says nothing is wrong with putting faith in a Morty. You just have to pick the right one. Cop Rick asks why there is a crib in the bedroom. Cop Morty says it is just something they do to make you feel bad. Later, with the Mortytown Locos restrained, Cop Rick goes to get medical supplies. Cop Morty walks out of the building just before it disintegrates in a blast that kills all the Mortys inside. Cop Rick asks what happened. Cop Morty says, same old story, Morty's killing Mortys. But Cop Morty killed those Mortys. He executed them to cover up his own corruption. Later at The Creepy Morty, a strip club for Ricks, Cop Morty meets with Big Morty, who pays him for eliminating the Mortytown Locos. Cop Rick realizes his partner is corrupt. He refuses the bribe. Big Morty points out that Cop Morty's last partner also refused. Cop Morty killed his previous partner. Cop Rick tries to arrest Big Morty. A gunfight breaks out. Cop Morty kills Big Morty's bodyguards. Cop Rick tells Cop Morty to do the right thing. Cop Morty starts crying and says he wants to be a regular kid. Cop Rick lowers his gun. Cop Morty immediately shoots Big Morty. Cop Rick shoots Cop Morty. Outside, Cop Rick tells other officers that it is the same old story. Rick's killing Mortys. The system corrupts everyone it touches. Even the Mortys who try to be better end up perpetuating the same violence. President Morty meets with the Shadow Council of Ricks. These are the wealthy and powerful Ricks who actually run the Citadel. Rick D. Sanchez III arrives late from dealing with the factory hostage situation. The council sits around a table while Barber Rick gives President Morty a haircut. Garment District Rick addresses President Morty directly. He uses air quotes around the title President Morty. He says they do not care who sits in that seat. A Rick, a Morty, or even a Jerry. It does not matter. They have been running the Citadel since before the council existed, and President Morty will find they are still running it now. President Morty asks if Garment District Rick really speaks for everyone. The other Ricks confirm he does. President Morty asks everyone to raise their hand if Garment District Rick speaks for them. Through the mirror President Morty holds, 7 Ricks raise their hands, including Rick D. Sanchez III and Garment District Rick. President Morty snaps his fingers. 2 Officer Ricks immediately enter and kill all 7 Ricks with shock lasers. Steve Jobs, Rick, and good-looking Rick did not raise their hands and survive. President Morty remains calm throughout this massacre. He asks Barber Rick if that is enough off the top. 3 more Officer Ricks enter to remove the bodies. President Morty turns to face the 2 surviving Ricks. He asks if it is enough. Both beg and say, yes, goddamn yes. President Morty responds good. He walks over to pour himself a glass of brandy. He looks out the window and begins speaking. He says this seems like a good time for a drink and a cold, calculated speech with sinister overtones. A speech about politics, about order, brotherhood, and power. The episode shows scenes of changes across the Citadel. New banners with Morty and Rick symbols cover old Rick emblems. Cop Rick puts on his new police badge. The 3 surviving school Mortys work new jobs. Officer Ricks drag dead council members to airlocks. President Morty continues saying that speeches are for campaigning. Now is the time for action. Outside the Citadel in space, 4 dead Ricks are ejected from an airlock, including Rick D. Sanchez III and Garment District Rick. The song for the damaged coda plays. The camera zooms out to reveal dozens of dead Ricks and Mortys floating in space. The bodies include Cop Morty, Big Morty, Investigator Rick, and Campaign Manager Morty. The floating documents from the dossier show photographs of a Morty with an eye patch. Another photograph shows candidate Morty removing his eye patch next to the puppet-controlled Rick from years earlier. The documents confirm that President Morty is evil Morty from close Rick counters of the Rick kind. The photographs float away into space. Nobody on the Citadel knows the truth about their new president. Evil Morty's strategy in this episode operates on a completely different level than his first appearance. In close Rick counters of the Rick kind, he used technical skills to build torture grids and hack portal guns. Those are impressive capabilities, but they represent brute force solutions. The Ricklantis mix-up demonstrates something far more sophisticated. Evil Morty understands how social systems work. He recognizes that the Citadel operates as a rigged game designed to exploit Mortys and lower-class Ricks while enriching a small group at the top, and he uses that understanding to manipulate the entire system. Evil Morty's campaign speech works because it tells the truth. He does not invent problems or exaggerate grievances. Everything he says about the Citadel is accurate. Schools do condition Mortys into compliance. Police do brutalize Mortytown. Factories do exploit workers. A Shadow Council does control everything behind the scenes. The episode spends its entire runtime demonstrating that Evil Morty's diagnosis of the system is completely correct. His speech resonates because every Rick and Morty watching knows from personal experience that he speaks the truth. This is Evil Morty's genius. He does not need to lie or manipulate when he can simply say out loud what everyone already knows but cannot acknowledge. The assassination attempt by campaign manager Morty actually helps Evil Morty rather than hurting him. Getting shot generates enormous sympathy. It makes him appear to be a martyr willing to die for his beliefs. It proves that powerful forces want to stop him, which validates everything he said about the system being rigged. And most importantly, campaign manager Morty dies before he can share the evidence about Evil Morty's true identity. Investigator Rick also dies. All the evidence floats away in space. Evil Morty eliminates everyone who could expose him while appearing to be the victim. This suggests Evil Morty may have anticipated or even arranged the assassination attempt specifically because it served his purposes. The Shadow Council scene reveals Evil Morty's true nature. The council members thought they could control him. They assumed a Morty president would be a figurehead while they continued running things from behind the scenes. But Evil Morty never intended to be controlled. He already knew who the real power brokers were. He already planned to kill them. He just waited until they identified themselves by raising their hands. Then he executed them immediately without hesitation or remorse. This is not the behavior of someone who wants to reform the system. This is someone who wants absolute power. The episode's title, Tales from the Citadel, and its structure support Evil Morty's critique. The episode tells multiple stories about different characters across the Citadel. On the surface, these stories seem unconnected, but they all illustrate the same basic truth. The system is rigged. Rick J22 works hard for years, but gets passed over for Cool Rick, who has connections. Cop Rick tries to be ethical, but his partner is corrupt and kills him. Campaign manager Morty tries to expose Evil Morty, but gets executed before he can share the evidence. Slick wishes for change, and achieves it only through self-sacrifice. Every storyline demonstrates how the system crushes people who try to resist it. Evil Morty succeeds where everyone else fails, because he does not try to reform the system from within. He seizes control of the entire structure and rebuilds it according to his own vision. The floating documents at the end provide the final revelation. The photographs prove that President Morty and Evil Morty are the same person, but nobody on the Citadel knows this. The evidence floats away in space, along with the bodies of everyone who could have exposed the truth. Evil Morty achieved perfect surprise. He infiltrated the Citadel's political system, won the presidency through democratic election, massacred the Shadow Council, consolidated absolute power, and nobody knows who he really is, or what he is truly capable of doing. This represents a far more sophisticated operation than his first appearance. He did not just scan one Rick's brain. He took over an entire civilization. The episode ends with Rick and Morty C-137 returning from Atlantis completely unaware of what happened at the Citadel. Rick says that place will never have any bearing over their lives ever again. But the audience knows this is wrong. Evil Morty now controls the most powerful organization in the multiverse. He has access to all the Citadel's resources and technology. He commands armies of Ricks and Mortys, and he has demonstrated both the intelligence and the ruthlessness to use that power effectively. Rick C-137 thinks he is done with the Citadel, but the Citadel under Evil Morty's control is far from done with him. Evil Morty's deeper motive becomes clear through this episode. In his first appearance, he seemed motivated primarily by revenge against Ricks, but the Ricklantis mix-up reveals something more complex. Evil Morty understands that the Citadel operates as a system of exploitation. Ricks exploit Mortys. Wealthy Ricks exploit working-class Ricks. The Shadow Council exploits everyone. This exploitation is not accidental. It is the entire point of how the system functions. Evil Morty's campaign speech exposes this truth. His presidential victory proves that this truth resonates with the majority, and his massacre of the Shadow Council demonstrates his willingness to use violence to dismantle the exploitation. But he does not dismantle it to create equality. He dismantles it to install himself at the top of a new hierarchy. The title, Tales from the Citadel, suggests that these stories represent common experiences rather than unique events. Rick J. 22 is not the only factory worker who gets passed over for promotion. Cop Rick is not the only idealistic cop who gets killed. Campaign Manager Morty is not the only person who tries to expose corruption and fails. These things happen constantly across the Citadel. The episode just shows a few examples. Evil Morty succeeds because he recognizes these patterns and uses them. He knows workers are angry. He knows cops are corrupt. He knows reformers get silenced. He builds his entire strategy around exploiting these predictable patterns within the system. This demonstrates strategic thinking that goes far beyond simply being smart. Evil Morty understands sociology, psychology, economics, and power structures at a level that most Ricks cannot match, despite their supposed genius. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.